In our irony poison culture, where caring too much or too little will make the terminally online mad at you. And in our overstimulated .com ecosystem, where everything has already been said, how the fuck do we do satire anymore? Baseball, rambles the lead singer of Viagra Boys on their breakout hit Sports. The music video features a man who looks like a speed dealer loitering around the middle of a bus mall, harassing students for some bus money, and this man lumbers around a tennis court mid-game. The ball bounces off of his head so casually that he doesn't seem to notice it, presumably because he's high off of his tits. He seems confused by the terms he is saying. Suggesting that he's snorting white powder down by the beach rather than actually sliding down a sand dune. Maybe? I wouldn't put it past this guy, honestly. He seems to just be expressing whatever is in front of him, stimuli in, words out, no matter what they are. Meanwhile, a pretty meat and potatoes punk rock song scores the words. The drums are in 4/4, the bass is thick, and the guitar lumbers along, piping up when the chorus arrives. It's catchy, oddly alluring, especially due to the sour synth tones in the background. Awkwardly, the lead singer dances a daggy dance, and we cut to him being interviewed post-match. As the song progresses, it slowly grows more demented. The cries of "sports" have more gravel packed into their tone, the guitars and drums slow and start up with the pace, and some saxophone enters the increasingly chaotic mix. The vocals become desperate, and everything just drunkenly falls apart, a puking mess on the floor. What the fuck just happened, dude? I don't know, but I am sure of one thing. It's pretty fucking funny. The key here is the earlier shot where the tennis ball bounces off of the lead singer's head. Even to someone who has never heard of them before, it immediately communicates this band. Not only do they not take themselves very seriously at all, but they are trying to make a point. When you read the lyrics for Sports, it just reads as a list of things. Baseball, ping pong, and naked ladies. There's barely any connective tissue apart from the fact that they're all sports, seduction here being a sport rather than seeking vulnerability. The lyrics are usually, but not always, coded in masculine signifiers, subverted and reinforced by the comments about short shorts and naked girls. The structure of the song, which at first feels driving and stable, slowly but surely falls apart as the vapid lyrics become more desperate. The song in microcosm is about the vapidity of a certain type of masculinity. Let's call this guy your uncle. Blunt, boring, insensitive, but ultimately fragile. Talk to your uncle about trans people, talk to them about the Labour government, and watch as their masculinity crumbles under the slightest pressure. Of course the band are playing the song for laughs, it's all a big gag to them, and I think the joke is very funny. Obviously explaining why something is funny is redundant and all, but one of the defining traits of this band is that they hate people, that they find them annoying and abrasive and uncouth, and I love that because I also hate people, kind of. So, who are Viagra Boys exactly? Well, for the uninitiated, they are a Swedish post-punk band, and thus far they have released 3 albums. I plan on focusing on the second and third records in this piece because, to me, they are the most interesting albums they have made, although their first album, Streetworms, is definitely worth checking out. The band are mostly Swedish natives who recruited the American-born singer and lyricist after, get this, one of them got a tattoo from him, and then they heard him sing a Mariah Carey song later in the evening, and they were just like, yep, that's the guy. Weird world. Sebastian, the American singer, said that he stayed in Sweden because of socialism. That's pretty basic to me, admittedly. Thus, the 6 members of the band, of all different ages, tastes, and backgrounds, they make for a pretty eclectic band with a very dynamic sound. They are abrasive and certainly an acquired taste, but they are instantly recognizable and they're full to the brim with personality. They resist marketability by just having their name be what it is. Often remarked is that the band were worried in the early days about emails being sent to spam folders for obvious reasons. The band is political, but they go about their politics in a different way to some other punk bands. They aren't keen on sloganeering or even really critiquing policy. That's been done better by other bands. Instead, they wish to look at the terrible flaws of individual people and ask what makes these bad people tick. Despite the abrasive character of the music, there is a surprising level of forethought and subtlety to the language employed in their music. So, this is where we get to talk about rhetoric. Whoever studies rhetoric digs into the semiotics of phrases and the symbolism of the arguments they make. Because through the study of persuasion, we can get to the core of what our beliefs say about us and what we actually want to achieve. We study the specific choice of words, the sequence of which they sit in, and investigating what those choices stand for makes for a fascinating field of study. My favorite book about rhetoric is Jason D. Galdino's Rhetoric for Radicals, as it provides both semiotic analysis and practical advice for young people who are trying to change things, and I think that some of its advice could be useful in the context of punk, a genre that is fiercely political, youthful, and broadly skeptical of power structures. Rhetoric often has a bit of a nasty reputation as a field of study because it's bound up in images of propaganda, percentages and decimals. You add this word and take away that one to keep the sheeple asleep while you misdirect rage onto the unfortunate. But we shouldn't be so hesitant to talk about rhetorical strategies because all communication is marred and constructed by implied ideas and unexamined wants. So the art of rhetorical analysis is pausing to think and analyze what you want to say before you actually say it. Let's return to sports for a good example of this. When Sebastian says, "Volleyball, naked girls, naked boys do the dance," he's countering the benign quality of comparing the nakedness of women to sports balls, and he undercuts this of the image of naked boys as well. It gives the song a bit more of a bisexual flair, and this is also communicated by the cadence. The pause between naked girls, beat, and naked boys is much longer than naked boys do the dance. He moves along much faster, communicating to the audience that he, the singer, not the character, knows that this is trite, although it is logically consistent to the narrator's voice, because he sees the nakedness of boys as code for sexy times. It also highlights how older men fetishize youth in creepy ways, so he highlights this by mentioning a boy as well. If an actual sexist codger listens to this song and pays attention enough to the lyrics, he won't really be likely to laugh along, or even sing along, because of homophobia. So it gets around the problem of satire, appealing to those who already agree with it, while the critiques are absorbed by those who don't think it is funny commentary. It is a conscious and surprising subversion of expectations, all communicated by the sequence and cadence of the words selected. It is also important to note that rhetoric is not just words, but volume, cadence, posture, and costume. So we see this sleazy-looking guy, wearing sunglasses inside, daggy dancing in the middle of an active tennis game, and the implication of it all is that you can't take this guy seriously, so the vapidness of the lyrics, and by extension a certain type of man, shouldn't be taken to heart either. But make no mistake, you should take the band seriously. My own personal history of the band begins with their second record, Welfare Jazz. I remember listening to it when it first released back in early 2021. I listened to the album twice, I thought it was kind of neat. I laughed quite a lot at the music video for Ain't Nice, and then my life went to hell and I completely forgot about them. I initially saw them as a bit of a one-trick pony. They have this manic and sardonic tone, but I never really returned to them or took them seriously until I started this project. The satire of Welfare Jazz has become more elaborate since the beautiful simplicity of sports. The lead singer Sebastian often plays a character, and the album is a little story about him trying to become a better and more responsible person. And all of this is based on the life experience of Sebastian, who by his own admission was a real dirtbag when he first met the band and sang Mariah Carey to them. The type of guy he usually sings about? Yeah, that was him back in the day. When talking to NME about the writing process for the record, he said, "We wrote these songs at the time where I had been in a long-term relationship, taking drugs every day and being an asshole. I didn't really realize what an asshole I was until it was too late, and a lot of the record has to do with him coming to terms with the fact that I'd set the wrong goals for myself."
Much more in the other albums, I was that person, and I was living, I was channeling myself maybe more in the other albums, and now I'm not as clinically insane as I was.
And I will always support someone trying to be a better person. We tend to point and laugh at these problematic people, but the act of pointing means that your hand is facing away from yourself. And the band ask interesting questions about what they and their weird uncles have in common. Dialectics. The music thusly has a level of self-awareness about it. They are making fun of masculinity, but also recognizing toxic traits within themselves and trying to rise above them. And I love that. It's funny, it's self-deprecating, and serious all at the same time. It's about growth rather than wallowing in filth. We start the album with the gloriously sleazy Ain't Nice, which is like the thesis statement for what the band are doing artistically. The grimy bass and guitar linger and stumble as the vocals do their best to make you feel a violent repulsion. He sings in character about a geezer with a collection of vintage calculators looking for a place to store them. And there's this paradox in the character where he's manipulative, but he's straightforward in his approach. He's sly but blunt. He's a dirtbag and he's proud about it. He'll leave you if you try to control him, but he'll ask you for food on the way out. The song is both oddly specific, the vintage calculators being both a private obsession and some kind of money-making scheme, and very broad about the type of guy your uncle is. The music video has a pretty impressive long take that lasts for about 1 minute and 50 seconds, in which this character, with his languid posture and abhorrent behavior, and he just ruins the day of everyone around him, stealing bikes, sputtering beers he didn't buy, ruining picnics. Yeah, this dude, he ain't nice. It's pretty straightforward, entertaining, and a good tone setter for the record. And after an instrumental, we arrive at Toad, a rockabilly-inspired country rager. It seems to be about a different person from the first song, and in my own interpretation this is fine, because the character from Ain't Nice sets up the themes that are then explored with this guy. Our protagonist starts off by complimenting the hospitality of his lover, and then declaring that he doesn't need no woman to tie him down. Well, I don't need no woman telling me when to go to bed and when to brush my teeth. Girl, if you ain't my mama, please don't try to be. This is clearly a parody of traditionally masculine men. He relies upon women to cook and clean for him, and then he declares how free he is from her influence. It displays how oxymoronic these men are, claiming to be agents of the free road and then relying upon women to do the most basic of tasks for them. And then they complain about having to complain, showing just how much women need to do for men for them to be considered good in the eyes of those same lazy, boring men. This guy is so awful that it makes you laugh. And this is clearly satire, but this is as good a time as any to bring up the use of irony and sexism as a rhetorical device. Ironic sexism, or as it is sometimes referred to as hipster sexism, is a touch more nuanced than the title might initially suggest. I originally was going to give you 3 examples to show you, but this video is already going to be heaps long, so let's just do one. On screen, we have an image of a cartoon duck, and the title reads, POV, you ask an English teacher to teach instead of getting pregnant. And then the duck has an angry meltdown. So this video, as blunt as it is, explains this topic beautifully. The lyrics of Viagra Boys are heavily cisgendered in tone, so I won't delve into the realm of ironic trans misogyny, although that's a fascinating topic that a lot of men do to trans girls. But nearly all of us went to school, and at some point had a teacher leave for several months due to health, bereavement, or indeed maternity leave. In my own anecdotal experience, my teachers did the former two, but not the latter. But the meme is initially funny because it evokes that experience as universal. We remember our teacher leaving, and the over-the-top reaction is a stupid response because it isn't that big of a deal. As if the specific role of the female English teacher is actually to get pregnant and not to teach English. But there are implications because of its ironic misogyny. Most importantly for us, the anger response of the duck, I'll just call her the teacher, is absurd, yes, but it's also a little self-absorbed. It says, I'm irrational and I neglected my teaching responsibilities by getting pregnant. None of us would say this to a pregnant English teacher, and we might not even think it. But that's the point of the joke. It crafts an absurdity out of women generally getting pregnant rather than doing their job, and you don't confront the absurdity because it's based upon a vaguely universal experience. Yes, it is ironic in its ultimate seriousness, but the really curious thing about ironic sexism is, whether or not you find it funny, it is still sexist. Very much so. You aren't any less demeaning because you don't mean the words that you're saying. You're just being an arsehole. But when it comes to ironic misogyny with a capital I and M, the point is deniability. You can't tell the difference between the sexist and the ironic sexist, because they both laugh like dogs, and the person becomes Schrodinger's arsehole if they get called out for it. And the use of it in the Viagra Boys discography is definitely not above scrutiny. These characters are always slimy dudes, often on drugs, and they always affect the women in their lives. And the lyrics are ironically using sexist rhetoric to critique what those words say about masculinity. Let's return to Toad, as it is likely the most illustrative example on the record. Well, I don't need no woman telling me when I go to bed and when to pick up all my things. Girl, I don't need to clean my room until I want to, because I'm a free man, baby. I belong to the open road. This chair is crazy uncomfortable. Let's go. There might be a little bit of this character in Sebastian by his own admission, so the writing on this song is to interrogate that misogynistic impulse. Cleaning up after himself is akin to a mother nagging after him. Women exist to serve rather than to exist alongside. The act of being a decent housemate, in a house that you're a guest, mind you, is akin to nagging and oppression. The place in which he stays is more akin to a motel where he can fuck the cleaner and cook. His blatant disregard for etiquette and respect is, of course, intentional. It shows how disrespectful a certain type of macho masculinity can be. The act of radical freedom makes one a real man rather than being a good person to those around you, on being supportive and strong on your convictions. It's also important to note that the commentary on the record is far from caustic. The main character doesn't refer to women as bitches or whores. Rather, the language is relatively tame, as this is a literary device used in order to not alienate the girlies in the audience. You're more than welcome to debate how effective that choice is, but in my own opinion, there is some forethought to it. So obviously on this song, we are set up with a real dirtbag, and that's fine. That's fine, because in a story you want drama. You want a character to see the errors of their ways so that they can strive to change. The sexism is ironic, but it does work into the overall narrative of the record. Not to spoil it for you, dearest viewer, but this hound dog does have a pretty dramatic change of heart just 2 songs later on Into the Sun, where he laments that he deserves what he has wrought. He will ride off into the sunset if the lady doesn't want anything more to do with him, a groveling, flagellant way to tear himself down for not being the loose unit he actually thinks he is. This slimy character expresses something akin to remorse, and slowly over the course of the record, he tries to win her back and quit drugs. How successfully that is left a touch ambiguous. So returning to Toad with the knowledge that this character doesn't really go on a grand journey of self-discovery and he relapses and sets back into his old self-centered behavior, the sexism as a character flaw becomes an investigatory theme on the record, and the irony makes it a little bit difficult to pass. Now, I don't really think that many people would look at this whole album and label as staunchly misogynist for this alone. Anyone paying attention at least, but I have a slightly more personal issue with the track. Not a problem, but a conundrum. On the one hand, the people that Sebastian sings about are real. There are people that I know in my life who are over 50 and partying with teenagers at their kid's birthday. You know, matching the kids drink for drink. It's like a social taboo to be that loose around kids. As the old saying goes, disco never dies, but it does grow a bit sad after a while. They have this magical lack of self-awareness, which, to me, as a person who is a bit neurotic, socially anxious, and highly self-critical of himself, it genuinely is like watching a horse just run free in an open field. There's something kind of magical about how these people just do what they like, and they just have a good time. And you might talk shit about them to your friends, but they are kind of legends in your eye. You sort of envy their carelessness in a way, not in a hipster sexism way, but in a to be free of social anxiety altogether, to not worry about what others have to think about you, and you just allow yourself the joy of fun. My fascination with them is rooted in their personal psychology. I sonder and I wonder, how the fuck are you like this? And they aren't always men. The uncles in your life, they can be your loose auntie trying to slip you a glass of wine. But more often than not, it's an older fella who's just fucking joins in on the fun. But at the same time, and it's very important to recognize that this perspective comes from the fact that I am a man. And a man is generally not creeped on by your uncle. I can look at these people as kind of magical because they're not going to harass me. And sure, I can protest any sexism I hear and I can call it out, but it isn't aimed at my existence as a sexual object. So, if I were an underage girl who was at that same party, I would imagine that my feelings would be quite different. The privilege inherent in being an older man and having no one tell you to fuck off for creeping the partygoers out. The fact that these loose units often have loose tongues and they just say stupid, bigoted shit does not contribute to them being likable people. And all of this is to say that I am wary of glamorizing the characters on Welfare Jazz and on Cave World. Oh my days, how wonderful they are! They're just wonderful because they do and they say what they think. They're just so authentic. And that's stupid because some people don't find this shit funny. And that's fair. The sexism of the characters might not be artistically compelling to you if you're reminded of your shitty ex-boyfriend or your abuser. And that's totally valid. But to me, acknowledging all of this, I do think that their use of rhetoric and satire is transformative enough to transcend, precisely because it comes across as examination and introspection. It's kind of post-ironic in a sense, this pretense about pretense that definitely indicates a level of forethought put into the piece of art. So, if the internal logic of ironic misogyny goes, it's funny because I should know better, then Viagra Boys demonstrate that they do know better, and that element itself is built into the critique. These men of whom Sebastian writes are funny in the way that they resemble your black sheep relative, but by recognizing their humanity, we can see them within ourselves and move beyond their unironic impulses. It's the difference between using irony to excuse bad behavior and putting in the work to actually be a better person. After all, the defining characteristic of hipsterism is ironic detachment. I like cassette tapes because they're an obsolete medium in the streaming era. The core of the problem is that you mock sincerity, and it actually takes a lot of sincerity and earnestness to actually care about something enough to call it out. Viagra Boys kind of straddle the line between sincerity and ironic detachment, and that makes them super interesting. In a cultural sphere where everyone cares about being super PC and acting like they have it all figured out, it's kind of refreshing to see a sleazy little band like Viagra Boys, these loose units who make great music about your weird uncle, because that uncle is a really interesting type of guy, and understanding him, we can understand ourselves. By being just a little bit edgy and grating, they are able to critique big social issues without seeming like they care all that much. Begone all you bands who care about your hair, your clothes, your rings. We are here to talk about dogs, prawns, and beer bellies. We call shrimp prawns in Australia. Don't be mad. I think the band wants you to think about ironic misogyny, and they also want you to think about how it affects other people. And this approach works very well for welfare jazz. It's very individualistic, and their satire works well enough when it talks about your uncle or whatever. But if the band were to, say, broaden their horizons and tackle a more controversial systemic issues, how would they fare exactly? Chapter 2, Cave World. Cave World is, without a doubt, the band's most diverse, cutting, and ambitious record to date. The band could have written another record about seedy dudes and played it relatively safe instrumentally, but they really swung for the fences here, and I love watching someone swing big. The album cover is so evocative, with its pastel color scheme and minimalist imagery. An atom bomb in the center, circulated by motifs that pop up on the album. Drugs, technology, animals, masculinity. With the most curious addition of the obelisk from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Sebastian has gone on record in interviews saying that he loves the film and he watches it 3 times a year, so the album is conceptually more ambitious, moving on from the ills of loose units to confronting the flaws of the human condition and seeing how they influence life today.
When I just started thinking about the world today and human beings in general and what's wrong with all of it, I started making this I tried to think back on our history on the earth, and I came to the conclusion that it all started getting fucked as soon as we began existing, basically, or as soon as we became humans.
We will get into that side of the record in a little bit, but I want to see how this record grapples with the older motifs of welfare jazz. Where welfare jazz told the story of one main character, maybe 2, depending on your interpretation, Cave World is made up of several character portraits. They orbit the main focus of the album, which involve the flaws that are endemic to the human character. Problems that have been with us since we lived in a cave world. Every song isn't about this, though. There's this old rule of thumb when it comes to album construction. You can go on a narrative or an auditory tangent, but come back to your main theme within 3 songs. So, Baby Criminal, a song about a man who goes from a baby to an amateur nuclear reactor builder. Reminiscent of stories in real life. I'll put some of them up here, whatever. And this sets up the question: where did we go wrong? Troglodyte sets the tone, we deviate a little with Punk Rock Loser, we come back to it with Creepy Crawlers and the Cognitive Trade-Off Hypothesis, you get the gist. The sequencing on this album is just stupendous. It contains many highs and just enough breathers to build back up tension between those big songs. It makes for a very pleasant listen. The album is even more consistent than welfare jazz, because they aren't tied down to having to tell one linear story. There's always some new, interesting idea being explored, and since the theme is grander in scope, the narrative takes a more sonorous approach towards the ills of humanity. So each character on the album is a piece to the larger puzzle of the human condition being flawed. To start in a weird place, let's have a look at Ain't No Thief. their loudest and most caustic sounding song yet. Like, I'm a pretty big noise rock head. There's my stuff. Please don't fall backwards. I don't want to die. Wouldn't it be funny if I died on camera? I could dig through my record collection. I'm just gonna go lightning bolt because it's like one of the best records ever made. I'm a big noise rock head, but I struggle to listen to Ain't No Thief because it's so grating. And I do ultimately mean that as kind of a compliment. The song is about one of the most caustic and obnoxious people that they've ever cooked up, so I do like that the music is so violent while also being genuinely funny. Like, this is a balancing act that the band often nails. The lyrics are straightforward enough. A man is accused of stealing a list of items, and the excuses get longer, more convoluted, and absurd. The cries of "quit bitchin' motherfucker" at the end of each accusation communicate that this guy, he's just the worst. It's pretty rare that a song actually makes me laugh out loud, and this song is so specific, and I do love that. I think that lying is a really interesting concept, which is why I was a touch disappointed that the track doesn't really go deep into the psychology of why people lie. You know, we lie to make ourselves look better than we actually are. We lie to be seen with kinder eyes by those we care for, and also to maintain a continuity of what we idealize ourselves to be. Instead, we get a deeper implication from the music video, which features Sebastian as a preacher in a church. The lyrics don't really address it, but the implication is someone is speaking these lyrics in a church before a congregation. Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that preachers can lie and mislead people. You know, consider mega pastors like Kenneth Copeland and Jimmy Swaggart. Blokes who made millions by exploiting the faith of millions. Admittedly, the metaphor is a bit juvenile, a bit I'm 14 and this is deep core, but the band are allowed to make a silly one. You know, it's funny. Like, it doesn't matter if it's not that deep. I hope that they come back to this topic because there's so much fertile soil here for commentary. The track Big Boy was the first song from the record I heard, and it's still my favorite. I didn't listen to the album when it came out in 2022 because I was busy doing other things, working, paying rent, writing feature-length videos about conspiracy theories and eugenics. Oh, studying as well. And I'm glad I finally got back to it. It has a lumbering, slacker quality to the instrumental that is filled out by this driving percussion, and the addition of hip-hop drums and some bongos toward the end really make the song into a real groovy trip. I haven't been able to praise the musicianship of this band enough in this video, as I'm trying my damnedest to keep this video focused, but this and tracks like Six Shooter from Welfare Jazz are some of my favorite songs because they have this jammy vibe, some instrumentation. Big Boy is kind of about this boring guy and he's a big boy because he pays his rent and he has a big TV and he ain't got no problems with his insecurities. You know, you're a man if you buy shit you don't need to pay your bills on time. Men as a consumer subject, and you consume to soothe the fact that you feel insecure in your manhood. As usual, Sebastian is making fun of his own weird hang-ups, his need for reassurance, and his fixation with masculine symbols. The track then coasts out with legendary British MC Jason Williamson of the Sleaford Mods fame. I don't know about you, but every record store owner I've ever met loves Sleaford Mods. It's as universal as their love for The Fall and Queens of the Stone Age. I'll say it, no one else will say it, I'm a big boy. Jason is every record store owner's favorite little guy. Prove me wrong in the comments. With his verse, he ties the disparate elements of being a big boy, both feeling grown, and then Sebastian's glorious beer belly, which is an element of the band's visual presentation that is it's truly the eye of the duck. It's the je ne sais quoi of their aesthetic. That is abhorrent posture, and it's also his penchant for crappy sunglasses, which bro is such a baby girl. I'd spoon him. But the most damning and vicious critique of masculinity on the record, probably within the whole discography. Probably, like, each individual members, like, their collective discographies making music. It's fucking troglodyte. A shiveringly cynical and cutting song. The track features some new wave-isms, some danceable synths, and some gloriously groovy grooves. It's a very pleasant song to listen to while still being a bit abrasive. The song tackles the relationship between masculinity, conspiracy theories, and mass shooters. It's so funny. Like, this whole album, it's just a collection of things that deeply interest me. Why didn't I listen to this sooner? So it's another story song. The protagonist thinks about bringing his gun to work and punishing all of those who he believes have done him wrong. He seeks retribution for something that isn't all that apparent, but we all recognize what it is. I need to go get the book, hang on. My butt. If you're interested in the scholarship behind masculinity, you are more than likely well acquainted with Michael Kimmel. Now, Kimmel was cancelled a couple of years ago because he bullied women at school. Great. Love that. I'm so glad that, like, this guy was, like, at the forefront of, like, positive masculinity for a hot minute there in, like, the late 10s. Great for men. Thank you, dude. But anyway, he came up with this really useful concept called aggrieved entitlement. And I feel like I bring it up in, like, every video that's kind of related to mass shootings and conspiracy theories. So, masculinity under capitalism is in deep crisis. You are promised as a baby boy that you will grow up and have a great job, a hot girlfriend, and material things that will make you happy. Your labor under our economic system will be worth it. This is owed to you. But these men, when they did grow up, they were confronted with the fact that consumerism was hollow, that women aren't going to want them just because they have means, that they have to face the great horror that they actually have to be kind to be attractive, and this entitlement to a future that didn't end up happening drives some men, not all, but some, to resent society at large. So this entitlement manifests sometimes in mass shootings. And you can be plenty uncharitable, and you can be like, oh, here's an example of a lady doing a mass shooting. Here's an example of a trans person doing a shooting. Whoa! But the overwhelming evidence and reality is that masculinity is in deep crisis, and as an act of revenge and retribution, men assert their masculinity by killing other people in senseless and often nihilistic ways. You're pathetic right now. But if you kill them all, you'll be remembered as a bad motherfucker on the news. So maybe you should do a mass shooting to escape the fact that you feel existential dread. Before mass shootings, it was celebrity assassinations. We don't talk about that enough anymore. This phenomenon is reflected a little bit on the opening verse of Baby Criminal. The whole, he was gonna be a star type of thing. The album asked, what turned this kid into a proper reprobate? And troglodyte is framed as part of the answer, which is explored on the next verse, framed as a kind of thought experiment for us to take in. So Viagra boys ask us to imagine ourselves as primates hundreds of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. And they ask us to imagine what would happen if these types of personalities were around in ancient times. These self-destructive, hateful, asocial weirdos who would rather kill themselves and those around them than change and, like, become better people. Well, they would have been ostracized, right? You know, sent away from the herd because humanity intrinsically has this tendency towards cooperation and kindness. And traits, like these traits are what allowed us to become the species that we are. Anthropologists often say that, like, the site, you know, the defining point of when a society becomes a society is when you find bones that are healed. Like, someone broke their leg like 100,000 years ago or whatever, and they dig up the bone and it's healed. Well, it basically means that, like, some beautiful person a very long time ago, you know, fed them and cleaned up after them. All these, like, that doesn't really happen in, like, nature because survival of the fittest and what have you. The band basically say we became people when we started to look out for those with broken bones because we care about our capacity for empathy, and this enabled us to keep the gene pool more diverse. And we had these cities and commerce and all of these, like, wonderful things that don't exist with other animals. The band are basically saying it's essentially inhuman behavior to act like a buffoon, and these people do deserve to be shunned by the rest of us. And this is a sentiment that I can rock with, because there has to be consequences for this destructive, antisocial behavior. You know, as the band put it, I'm going to read it out. But when we had hairy arms and legs, and you were still swimming around in a lake, yeah, you were still a troglodyte. You just evolved a bit too late. You're no ape. You're a troglodyte. I don't want to sound like a social justice warrior or anything, but oh my fucking god, I don't like that, actually. You know, when I said that this violent style of behavior was inhuman, it was mostly metaphorical, you know, devoid of the human qualities that I like and value, including, you know, kindness, empathy, and the like. But to literalize this inhumanness as strict speciesism is not great, rhetorically. The man at his computer, let's call him the troglodyte for brevity's sake, is assigned to a literal lower rung of the evolutionary ladder. We're up here, he's down here because he's a troglodyte. So a troglodyte is both pejorative for someone who is old-fashioned and grumpy, but also for a cave dweller who resisted the progress that agriculture represents. What really seals this line for me is, you evolved a bit too late. It basically says, I am the sophisticated life form, and you, my dear, are but a slimy little bug. The singer is correct because he is literally biologically superior to the troglodyte. So while we, the evolved human people, had hairy arms and legs, they, the devolved troglodyte shooter, were still swimming around in a lake, lagging behind in the Darwinist struggle for survival. It's also giving some, apologetics, the biblical belief that white people were created by God in his own image. And, the other races they existed before, but they weren't as good as Adam and Eve, because they just weren't made in God's image. So with this perspective, it's not dissimilar to how white people discuss anyone they perceive as non-white. Fields of phrenology and race determinism and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant immediately come to mind. Okay, let's cool down. I kind of hate the phrase, I'm disgustingly well-educated for this topic, because the utility of it is usually something akin to, I've read a whole book, or I've listened to a few podcasts about this thing. And also, I think education is beautiful. I think that it inherently cannot be disgusting because knowledge and learning are very good. But, in spite of myself, I am disgustingly well educated for this topic. So, this isn't a niche interest. This is a Category 7 level autism event, and it's a cope. Oh my god. So, you know what? I'm just gonna sit down. I don't give a shit. So I've made videos about every single element of the song, but you don't know me. Well, we're strangers. We don't even have a parasocial relationship yet. So you are, quite rightfully, you might be thinking to yourself, the old razzle-dazzle. Bruv. Aren't you overthinking it? The point of the song is to, tear down socially unacceptable behaviors. Not to be, racist or whatever. So, 3 things. First of all, hi sweetie, I'm Angus. Razzle's fine, you can call me Razzle. Secondly, I'm admittedly prone to overthinking things and jumping to conclusions. So, I initially wondered if the hip-hop breakdown towards the end of Big Boy was a meta-commentary on the nature of machismo in hip-hop. I thought it would be a bit weird to use a hip-hop beat to make fun of hip-hop culture, appropriating it aesthetically just to mock it, but, I was curious, as I'm inclined to be, and, I researched it, I looked it up a little bit, and according to the band, the producer did it while they weren't in the studio, and they kept it because they thought it made the song go harder.
And the more I kind of let things sink in and tried going out of my comfort zone, the more I liked the stuff, because I thought it was more it's more fuck you to what people expect from us.
I like genre mixing and I like experimentation, so that's cool. So I dropped that thought as curious, not inherently diagnostic. Third and final, though, because I thought about this quite a fair bit. What made me stop thinking that I was a dog barking at the wind was when I considered who the narrator of the song is. So when the boys write a song, they often write in first person. Hope I can keep all my shit at your place. I'm just your average punk rock loser. I have 6 or 7 lighters in my left pocket. So when Seb writes in first person and he's saying something kind of abrasive and obnoxious, we can usually assume that he's in character. And we talked about this in regard to Welfare Jazz, how he's playing these first-person characters that he doesn't actually agree with in order to do commentary. So, what does that mean when the pronouns of the song are in third-person perspective? He goes to work on his computer. He thinks about his gun at home. Well, to me, it indicates that Seb is telling us a story that he came up with. So on a track like Ain't Nice, the protagonist speaks in first person, and in the moment, the character and the voice, we are supposed to critique them as one, whereas the third-person perspective on Troglodyte is not meant to be critiqued in itself. It is the character that the voice speaks of that we were meant to critique. And this isn't the only instance of third person on the album. So, Baby Criminal barely identifies with the kid gone mad. It just tells the tale from alternating first and third person perspectives. Return to Monkey, which... We'll come back to it. Return to Monkey is also in third person. So, with this third person perspective, we can assume that Seb is actually the narrator. So, the specific problem with the use of it in this instance is that the narrator is in utter agreement with himself. There is no instance of irony, there's no telling if the narrator is in character, and he's just saying these awful things and we're supposed to critique it. It's just Sebastian. It's just Sebastian saying these things. There's no unreliable narrator shtick. And I know this because he just says it in interviews.
We gain the ability to see into the future and to plan and to think about our past, because that's also where we kind of developed egoism and the ability to plan, mass murders or, genocide or war or anything like that. I just started to develop this through this whole pandemic and all this shit. I kind of started to develop a kind of dark outlook on the human race in general. And it made me wonder, were we better off as monkeys?
He says that this is what he thinks mass shooters do. And it's possible that he could be in character in these interviews. And I got back into wrestling semi-recently. I like kayfabe. I like the work of Andy Kaufman.
Andy, I think you really hurt her. Doesn't matter. She doesn't have any money. Okay. She's poor. She can't sue me.
I like MJF quite a fair bit.
I'm 11.
Are you aware that your dad made a horrible mistake 11 years ago?
I like them as much as the next guy, and people can put up a front when you least expect it. But I don't think that's the case here. Because Sebastian in the interview seems really chill, and he's very easygoing. To me, if he was in character, he would be abrasive, he'd say stupid shit, he'd smoke a bong in the middle of a sentence, and then he'd yell at Melon Head for his stupid melon head. So when the narrator in Troglodyte says that the shooter ain't no way he's a troglodyte, instead, it's Sebastian giving a political opinion. That, yes, the troglodyte is a worse person than him because of their biological deficiencies. So on my very first listen of the song, before I figured out all that stuff, I gave Troglodyte the benefit of the doubt. I mostly focused on the music video, which it's great. It's perfect. No hate to the animators at all. It is perfect parts scrappy, detailed, and funny. No notes. It's just like the source material. It's concerning to me. But when I finally heard the song within the context of the wider album, when I just threw it on one day, and I started to lose my mind, I thought, with my big boy interpretation, my comment, that maybe I'm blowing this out of the water. Maybe I'm the one who is wrong, and I'm blowing it out of proportion. Even, as I started to research it, and Sebastian just repeats the sentiment on the final verse, stating that the potential shooter would not be welcomed by the other apes, not because he is socially unacceptable, unacceptable behavior, but specifically because he, quote, evolved a bit too late. It's really upfront. It's really upfront about it. And because it's super upfront, I Googled it. I checked Reddit threads. I looked for think pieces. Also to mention, I've talked to Viagra Boys fans in real life. I have a mate who likes it. I have two friends who like Viagra Boys. They were fucking dumbfounded when I brought this up to them. They were like, "Oh my fucking god, you're right." I didn't notice it. I've talked to online spaces. I've talked to a couple of people incognito. I scoured it. I really looked at it because it's really obvious to me. All of this, obviously. But there's nothing. And it's so bizarre to me because it's so prominent and it's so hard to miss. So, why? Why is that exactly? I think that the reason for why no one's talked about it is it boils down to aesthetic. The aesthetic of the song and simplicity. I don't think that it's because the fan base surrounding the boys is secretly racist. That would be really stupid to say here in 2024. Instead, I think that people come to Viagra Boys for the music and the scummy performance. They like how Sebastian looks and they like how he talks. It's dirtbag drag. It's funny and it's entertaining and it's a punk band. They just aren't concerned with being pretty or cool. And with the new wave dance punk and the rocking structure, people just listen to it. Make no mistake, I'm gonna criticize the shit out of the song. It's one of the best fucking instrumentals they've ever done. It is one of the best songs of 2022. It is so good. It is so groovy that I got angry. There goes a book. I got angry. And I continued listening to the song. And then I kept listening to it and I'm like, oh my god, it just keeps getting worse. I should specify what people actually like about the message of the song, because on the surface level, the call to ostracize asocial shooters is like a fine thing to say. Necessary, even. It's that part that really captures people's attention, and it's because that they agree with this sentiment that they don't give a second thought to how bonkers the language used is in the criticism. It's a classic case of confirmation bias in action. So, okay, before we go any further, like, I think I should give some disclaimers and some caveats, because some folks in the audience are going to be mad at what I have to say, and I don't want to unnecessarily ruffle people's feathers. I'm not trying to be provocative to piss you off. We'll talk about it. So allow me a couple of minutes to preempt some saltiness. The first, I don't come to punk for political philosophy. I don't come to punk for answers to existential issues. I don't even come to the genre for directions as to how I should live my life. Like, if I wanted that, I'd read a book. You know, because a book is a medium where you can elaborate upon as many appendices to elaborate on contingencies for as many pages and issues as you would like. It's a medium in which you don't have to fit an entire philosophical problem into the confines of a 2-minute punk rager. Just imagine trying to, like, explain the trolley problem in the medium of a song, all the interpretations of it all. It wouldn't work because it's like 500 words. With all of that said, I am interested in what punks have to say because they often have compelling things to say about hegemony and conformity and capitalism. You know, like, you can't be punk and also be racist, sexist, ableist, transphobic, because mass culture is hegemonically all of those things, and punk is inherently counterculture. And I get that. I like punk because I want to be appreciated by people for whom all of those values are important as well. To quote a band that I kind of like, "He hates me. I like that." So I don't expect political philosophy from punk. I don't expect political philosophy from Viagra boys. And I don't think you should either. I just wanted to make that clear. The second, I'm cautious that I come across as holier than thou in my videos, as if, like, I'm the rightest one, the beholder of the correctest opinions, and I'm giving them to you so that we can share in the revelry of being right. I don't believe that. I am of the firm belief that the point of media criticism is not being right, as if that were like a valuable moral commodity to be consumed to impress people at parties or work. But, like, media literacy is good because it helps you think for yourself and appreciate art all the more. It improves you as a person. I'll be real with you. 100% real. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I only have so much to say about this album because it is an incredibly specific cross-section of like 6 different weird special interests I've had in the past couple of years. Like, sincerely and without irony, if it wasn't for the autism, none of us would be here. If it wasn't for, like, the Asperger's, even though Asperger's is fake. Hans Asperger's was a Nazi. If it wasn't for, like, that, none of us would be here. Like, I threw this album on, utterly at random. My friend, Joelby, shout out to Joelby. Joel was like, oh, this album's really good, you should listen to it. He told me that in 2022, and I didn't. One day, in very early January, I just put it on, and, like, my brain, it just flooded with all of these ideas. Like, there were so many ideas, and just, like, when I make a video, I just know when something's taken a hook, like, just taken a hold of me. I just know I have to write something about it. So for as much as this album, like, frustrates me lyrically, I want to be productive and use it as a vessel to explore why certain types of language work politically and how we can better utilize rhetoric to achieve our own political ends. Obviously, all of this is just my opinion. Why would you be offended by a stranger on the internet? But my opinion is that Cave World falls short of its ambitions, and it becomes host to some very tempting cliches. And that's really interesting, and I want to explore that for the sake of education. Like, I genuinely think right now that dunking is utterly useless, because it doesn't add anything to the world. It's just fun. I think that this album is fun, and I want to use your love to educate you on a myriad of topics that I just so happen to be quite uniquely able to articulate. The third, I should say that, like, I'm not a puritanical person that demands absolute moral purity from the media that I like. Where's the album? I fucking love Black Midi. I love this album. And I think that the tactical employment of faggot on Eat Men Eat is legitimately genius. You fucking faggots ain't seen the last of me yet! I say that as like a big homosexualizer. Also in Barbarian.
What up, faggot?
Respectively, the best album and movie of 2022. Like, I got called faggot and retard every day in high school for my general faggery and my autism, so... And I don't think you should use those words willy-nilly, but I am not wholly against people employing them to make a point politically or artistically. I'm sure it feels really good for your neurotypical straights to, like, sit on your high horse and to proclaim that no one under any circumstances ever should use those words, but, like, let's be real. Like, an axiomatic approach to language does not allow for victims of that language to use it to talk about their own experiences. And there are limits. I do think that slurs have a historical and political context, and we shouldn't be reckless in our privileged employment of them. We'll talk about that a lot in the next chapter. But I'm, like, me personally, you're welcome to disagree with me, but I am not immediately offended when I hear someone say a bad thing, because I take art and context to be of supreme importance. You know, like, after a lot of consideration, I concluded that the ironic misogyny on welfare jazz was not coming from a hateful place. And while I have your attention, I'd like to gesture you towards being more critical of the things you like, because that will make you better at being a more media-savvy person. So I would like you to keep, like, 1, 2, and 3 of those points in your mind as I say this next bit. Troglodyte isn't bad because I disagree with it. It's whatever. It's a little bit ill-conceived, sure, and if it was just, like, the one song, I could live with that, you know? I could be like,
Yuff!
Yikes!
Jinkies and...
Jeepers.
I'd appreciate the rest of the record, and maybe it'd be like an interesting footnote in a wider video. But I'm gonna spoil the rest of the video for you. The album's called Cave World. This is the central theme of the record. Troglodyte is unquestionably the thesis statement. The previous song, Baby Criminal, explicitly asks, where did we go wrong? The failings of masculinity discussed on track like Ain't No Thief and Big Boy are also coloured by these observations. There seems to be this essential and inescapable flaw within the human character, and that is what makes us violent and cruel. And, like, I guess in abstract, I don't disagree. Like, I've read about the violence of history. The bloodshed, the hatred, the cruelty. I've seen videos of monkeys tearing each other apart for no reason as well. I've seen some footage. But we do it over, like, God and nationalism. It's a lot more complicated than, like, some weird monkey impulse. And I'm certain that, like, the line of argumentation on Cave World is underlaid with this, like, original sin style problem. The secularized idea that we are born with a sinning problem, and we must actively fight against it to be good. Once again, there might be something there, but to compare all of the cruelty of humankind to our history of being apes, or what the band refers to as the de-evolution of men in their own marketing, it's fucked up, because they're treating eugenics and conspiracy theories and mass shootings and the systemic failings of masculinity under patriarchy with this loose, careless variety of irony. So, why is that? Well, it's my opinion that it all goes back to 2001: A Space Odyssey. Of course I'm bringing it up. It's literally on the cover. A Space Odyssey is a film that I'd never seen before, but via cultural osmosis, I knew all the plot points of it. It commonly gets called boring for its first act, and that makes sense structurally. If you jumped into the high-concept computer space opera right after the monkeys, it wouldn't feel very tense, because it hasn't been built up to, so the dullness of the first half is intentional. And the second half is, like, without trying to be too hyperbolic, the single most gorgeous fucking movie I've ever seen in my life. Like, in ages, at least. It's just, like, back to back to back, perfectly composed shots. and beautiful set design and like immaculate lighting. It's kind of one of those intellectual things where like I sat back and I was like, yeah, I get it. I didn't emotionally connect with it very much, but yeah, I was like, holy shit, this movie's amazing. Might be controversial. 2001 is pretty fucking good. Thanks, Sebastian, for prompting me to finally watch it after all this time. So, to get back to the point of this video, our ancestors are portrayed as violent in the film. They beat up other apes, but they aren't powerful enough to maintain their stranglehold on the local watering hole. But it's only after we started using bones as weapons to kill other apes that we became powerful. And then the ape throws the bone in the air, and we get the Kuleshov effect cut to the spaceship, and we get the all-time great implication that it was our capacity for violence that allowed us to become the apex predator. But the thing about 2001 is that we didn't suffer from some deterministic drive towards violence, right? The apes were not powerful for no reason whatsoever. Instead, like, narratively, that was thrust upon the apes by the alien monolith. So the monolith in the movie stands in for God, or the Almighty bestowing upon us sacred knowledge. It's kind of whatever we want it to be, realistically. Like, you can just project anything you want onto it. So for my own artistic creative purposes right now, I'm just going to say that it's God. There's an element of tragedy to the movie, where we could have been these relatively peaceful creatures. We bonk other monkeys on the head with our fists, but we had this Promethean fire thrusted upon us, like unbidden, and now we can create all of these fantastic things, but we are unfortunately cursed to continue killing ourselves over and over, amplified with the fact that a robot that we made started killing us in space. So, the Greek myth, Prometheus, is obviously creationist and polytheistic in origin, but 2001 is inherently secular. The monolith stands in for an uncaring thing. We don't understand how it works, but yet it is tremendously powerful. Cave World is likewise secular, but without the monolith, an actual Lovecraftian observer that cursed our species, the message comes across as this original sin-style problem that it was just inherent in our DNA. The other problem is that Cave World isn't anywhere near as nuanced as the film. And granted, well and truly granted, the movie is 2.5 hours long and the album is a tight 43 minutes. An extraterrestrial entity with no discernible emotion cursed our ancestors, and now we suffer for their curiosity. Prometheus setting in motion the chain of events that led Pandora to cursing us with no hope for the sake of a theodicy. We should bring back theodicy. Love a good theodicy. But in Cave World, we suck because we have always sucked, we climb down from the trees, and we have sucked henceforth. This stems in part from Sebastian's level of curiosity in the subject. This was a quarantine fascination for him. Bro got super interested in the lives of cave people and our Neolithic ancestors generally. And that's cool. Legitimately. I don't want to be bad faith and not acknowledge that the lead singer discovered an interesting topic and wanted to write a concept album about what he had learned. I think punk bands should write more themed albums, more geek rock shit. I freely admit that some of it is actually quite interesting to me. Like on the aforementioned cognitive trade-off hypothesis, named, as the song explains, after the idea that our ancestors sacrificed their long-term memories for a grander long-term memory, the capacity for language and such. We lost our ability to recall numbers flashed on a screen at the cost of civilization. And when he wonders out loud whether or not this could potentially explain the phenomenon of attention deficit disorder, that's great. I think it's a really interesting topic for a song. It's a bold gamble, and I ultimately think it pays off. Alright, I'm gonna have to derail the video, because, this video is already, heaps long. You clicked on it. There's another point that I feel like I have to, acknowledge in girthsome fashion, because it's gonna be, I think, a popular retort to this video, defensive in character. So before I go into it, I would highly recommend the YouTube channel Professor Sky's Record Review. Similarly pseudo-academic reviews of music by an actual French-speaking academic. So the professor, I'm going to call him the prof, not disrespecting Mr. Sky. The professor compares the work of Viagra Boys to political satirist J-Reg. I love that crazy little centrist.
I have every fetish simultaneously. So, yes,
so
every...
You're necrophiliac.
Yes. Yeah.
And the school of meta-irony generally. So, meta-irony is the step beyond post-irony that I touched upon with my Silent Hill video. And because I didn't... I look back on it, I don't think I explained it all that well. So let's redefine post-irony and meta-irony here, okay? So imagine I have an apple. That's pretty funny, actually. I should have bought an apple for this bit. That's fucking hilarious. Appreciate this JPEG of an apple. So the natural state of consciousness is that I look at an apple and I see it as food. I think to myself, well, I'm hungry and I like apples. And the most logical way to stop myself from being hungry is I want to eat an apple. So I eat it. And that is a state of unironic sincerity. It's layer zero. Layer zero. Zero pretense whatsoever. Irony and sarcasm in its purest form is generally when I'm with a friend. Irony helps when you have two people. And the friend offers me an apple because I said I'm hungry. So I grab the apple, I feign a bite, and then I peg it at the wall. And I loudly proclaim, I hate apples because they make me want to throw up. So that's layer one, pretense. So post-irony would be my friend giving me an apple after I said I'm hungry. I say it out loud that I hate apples because they make me feel sick, and then I eat it and it's core. So the overkill is the funny part, but I can't... My friend is looking at me and like, wait a second, I thought they said apples made them feel sick. Are they hungry? So post-irony is the point where it stops being immediately certain what the truth actually is. But this is layer two. It's pretense about having pretense. And then, believe it or not, we can go further. I pick up my apple, I proclaim that I hate apples because they make me feel sick, I eat it and its core, and then I throw it up. I vomit everywhere. And that's meta-irony. Layer 3. It's pretense about having pretense about pretense. It's about being so ironic that you look utterly, absolutely sincere. It's... The best way I can describe it is the pretense is kind of horseshoe theoried itself back around to sincerity. So, irony can go even further down this path. Your friend has no fucking clue why you're slurping your own vomit off of the table and arguing that, no, I'm on 10 layers of irony, actually. They make me feel sick. Ha 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 ha. But meta-irony is the point at where it stops being obvious about what you actually believe. So I've already argued that this is kind of spiritually akin, and do recall those words, to the use of misogyny in Viagra Boys' lyrics. So if sincerity is just being sexist, irony would be this like kind of knowing glance of like, wench, make me a sandwich. And then post-irony would be like, as a feminist, I think that women should become chefs, because that'd be great for women. And then meta-irony would be like being sexist to critique toxic masculinity and your own inadequacies as a man. And that's almost exactly what Viagra Boys are doing with their art. The lyrics are sketchy on the face of it, but we know that with the band's presentation and performance, that there's a hell of a lot of pretense to the rhetoric. So the prof then argues that Troglodyte also has a pretty obvious Devo inspiration to it, and he supports this by going into interesting detail about the philosophy of Devo, and how he thinks it influenced the writing on Cave World. So like, I'm not going to pretend that I have this deep appreciation for Devo that the prof does. Before this project, I was familiar with two albums of theirs. These two, I don't own them. It really struck me when he said that they were meta-ironic, because when I listened to them, I thought that they were completely and utterly sincere. They have some snark. Definitely some snark. You know, you don't get whipped. Whip it real good. You know, there's some irony there. But I researched it, and their inspirations, they come from Dadaism, anti-capitalism, Italian futurism. So I now recognize, and I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt, that there is a lot of subtlety to Devo. So I want to explain... There's a fucking fly flying around them. So I want to illustrate that briefly. When I first heard Devo's debut, I didn't really like this track. I'm not going to say it because it's a slur. I thought that it was a bit crass and outdated, a product of the 70s and what have you. But for the sake of argument, I would like to explore this track as if it were coming from a meta-ironic lens. And let's be incredibly generous, and let's set aside the ableist and racist implications of the word and treat it as the band most likely intended it. And let's assume, for argument's sake, that they aren't literally writing about someone with Down syndrome. There's so much language that suggests that. So under a meta-ironic lens, we are talking about a pre-human cave person and a worker simultaneously. So in the track, the protagonist he's happier than you and me, he wore a hat, he had a job, he brought home the bacon, and under this lens, the band are clearly making a statement about the relationship between workers, commerce, and our natural state of being. The worker is not really happy he's sedated, not smart enough to realize that he's being taken advantage of, but look, bro, he's still happier than you and me. And that itself is like commentary on being a leftist. To be dumb is to be happy, as Kurt Cobain put it. I think that the meta-ironic lens is a valid way to view the song, although you do have to acknowledge some asterisks. So what the prof argues is that Viagra Boys are actually invoking Devo in their employment of eugenicist language. The way that Devo went about their theory of devolution was that we peaked as apes and that we've been going downhill ever since. The character on that song is happier even though he's further back in time. It's different to what was being said on Troglodyte, though, where the assumption is that we peaked as humans and over time we have gone downhill. Devolved being distinct from devolved. So the prof argues that it is the Troglodyte that is actually looking back in time, rather than how I argued it was Sebastian as the narrator. And the narrative of the story is actually about him realizing that he himself was not a powerful primate. Subtextually, he is saying, you thought you were once this powerful ape, and now you realize you are actually a scared little monkey sitting in a cold cave. And this employment of meta-ironic language is meant to be a metaphor for fascism. Fascists look back at history and they see the Vikings and the Crusaders and they see these powerful white men of great blood and stock, when in reality these men suffered terribly from dysentery and they only had 3 limbs after battle. They were not glorious, they were maimed and afraid. I think that this perspective is quite compelling, and I reckon it's very comforting to Viagra Boys fans because it means that the band aren't being literal in their language. But the thing about meta-irony is that, once again, you can't tell how serious they're being. Is the person who threw up that apple actually hungry, or do apples actually make them feel sick? So like with ironic misogyny, I don't feel that the band can use eugenical rhetoric without purpose. They can't invoke racist tropes without coming across with a salient critique of racism. And there is no evidence of pretense whatsoever on Troglodyte, made doubly confusing because of how serious the band are being here. The genre of punk is sometimes nihilistic, but it is ultimately sincere. Back in the day, you couldn't get a job if you were dressed as a punk, and many things chafed against you because of it. But Devo were punk, and they had a meta-ironic sense of humor. They rarely meant what they said, and they hid their politics behind several layers of innuendo. Devo managed to balance those things well enough, and with all of that context we can appreciate their art academically. But their 2 biggest hit singles were taken as merely ironic. No one actually wants to get whipped, tee-hee. But the song wasn't widely accepted with 4 layers of pretense. So intellectually it might be good satire, but rhetorically it isn't because it wasn't persuasive. With the way Troglodyte is structured, it's third-person perspective, it's prescriptive language, it's vitriol. It's hard to read it as anything but sincere. And I think it's fine to pull aesthetically and musically from Devo. Viagra Boys, they're paying tribute to one of the greats. But to pull from their lyrics without fully understanding their meta-irony is deeply problematic because they can't articulate their critique effectively. Thus, it comes across as accidentally eugenicist. So while I think the prof has made an interesting point with his video, I ultimately disagree because of how serious the subject is. Meta-ironic eugenics isn't funny because eugenics isn't funny. I do respect this guy, but I think he's giving Viagra Boys too much credit. It is compelling, and Devo are certainly part of the puzzle, but it isn't entirely what the band aimed to achieve creatively with Cave World. They haven't said anything about that in interviews. They just so happen to be making fun of toxic masculinity, a symbol of their consumption of internet-based satire, an issue that we will explore towards the end of the next chapter. Sebastian talks exactly the same way about mass shooters and conspiracy theories as he does in the songs and interviews. So after sincere consideration, I genuinely think that Sebastian is just hungry for an apple in this case. And his amateur understanding, rooted in a place of personal curiosity and his viewing of a few documentaries and Wikipedia binges, it isn't sufficient enough to craft a thematically ambitious record. I've just realized that I have to find a book at the bottom of this pile and I have no fucking idea where it is. Oh, it's right there. I didn't script that. So now that we've discussed that, we're going to have to delve a little bit into the topics of evolutionary psychology and polygenic biology. So I have pretty fundamental and philosophical disagreements with both fields, and they've been used to, do colonialism and enforced intelligence testings in dodgy, dubious, and dumbass ways. This is a great book about it, by the way, The Myth of Race by Robert Wald Sussman. It's a really good book. Not the only one you should read. What's that book called? The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. Oh, that's a great fucking book. I highly recommend that. Superior, The Return to Race Science is also really good. You should read that. Generalized reading that you probably should do if you believe that racism is bad. I do want to be fair and acknowledge that, evolutionary psychology is kind of interesting. It's a curious field of study. For instance, our fight-or-flight reflex, it's certainly a holdover from when we were like little rat guys in a forest running away from primordial predators. Our sex drive, the utility of and the pleasure of orgasm, definitely a useful trait when like an animal reproduced and continued on their line. Pretty essential. Have you ever heard like a baby cry? Like really cry? Like the guttural scream? It physically stresses me out. Like it grabs your attention and you immediately want to go over to the baby and be like, oh my fucking god, stop crying. I will do anything to stop you from crying. And like that was useful because if babies weren't looked after, they would die and they wouldn't continue their line. So it was evolutionarily essential for us to develop that trait. And there are dozens of other examples of interesting applications that were useful and yet still around. We are animals at heart, and it would be deeply weird and academically dishonest to insist that just because we do calculus and build churches, we therefore can't have any holdover traits from animal times. So I'm not arguing that evolutionary psychology is not a curious field of study, but what I am arguing is that it's like 5% of that what is useful to know and practically compelling to consider when we talk about how we function today. And that 5% is generous. So the problem with Troglodyte and also Return to Monkey is that it assigns an original sin-style problem to humanity at large while comparing that to mass shooters and then employing the types of rhetoric that was, in fact, used to suppress other peoples as biologically and deterministically inferior. Their usual individualist shtick of describing the behavior of loose units really falls apart when contrasted against all of humanity. So the single most interesting thing about this album, the reason why I made this video, because I couldn't stop fucking ruminating on it, is this specific rhetorical strategy. It's all over the album. So the track uses a right-wing structure to achieve a left-wing aim. So it uses conservative cliches to affirm leftist values. Mass shooters are bad because there is something fundamentally wrong with them. Not strictly because of social forces that influence them. Instead, they are apes and they should be banished from society. And I must reiterate that in abstract, I don't disagree that there's something mentally wrong with asocial shooters. There often is something deeply mentally, biochemically wrong with their brains. But this motif is across the whole record, and it is really far from nuanced. I'm just drinking cranberry juice. Some people drink cranberry juice because it makes their cum taste better. I drink it because it tastes disgusting. The track Return to Monkey started as a meme. Seb thought it would go hard if a bunch of punks at his show screamed, "Leave society, be a monkey." And that mental image is pretty funny. But then he says he has to write the rest of the song.
And then I was like, oh fuck, I have to write some verses to it as well. Or I have to write some actual lyrics. And then when I wrote the lyrics, it kind of was this fuck you to all these people that think they have these answers and whatnot.
And in sequencing, they place the song at the end of the album. So it is functionally, literally, the final statement, the point we're supposed to take after it all. And they chose to approach it, again, with right-wing rhetoric and left-wing verbs and adjectives. So the first verse affirms the potential bliss of being a monkey. No rent, just eating bugs. The chorus reinforces that meme value. Simple bliss, no etiquette. Then the next verse talks about a conspiracy theorist worried about the vaccine and transhumanism, so in amusing fashion I might add. Sebastian says that, hey, no one has to get vaccinated in the jungle. You monkeys can just jack off all day for all he cares, just don't bother us.
Is that kind of asking them to take themselves out of the gene pool or something?
Maybe if I make these people sound completely insane, but I don't think they are. They're just as insane as I am.
He's essentially urging theorists and skeptics who are implicitly willing to let people die if it means they don't have to get the vaccine in time, in terms of them getting the disease and then giving it to someone else. The anti-vaxxer, like the troglodyte, is asocial, utterly without empathy, and unwilling to be a team player, to do their part to protect the herd. I think the sentiment is funny. Pretty funny. But it isn't exactly contextless either. The chorus changes its context even though it's saying the same words. Instead of the meme phrase, a desire to live in a simpler rent-free world, some people should be ostracized because they are acting like uncivilized animals. The sentiment turns from bliss to stupidity. You are too stupid and too selfish to be a human, thus you are a lower form of consciousness. The third verse deals with a conspiratorial bigot, a xenophobe and a subtextual anti-Semite, a more radical kind of theorist who then finds freedom in being a monkey since his living in a tree means he doesn't have to get 5G in his hair. The subtext here is that the bigot is a monkey because he is proud of his own unwillingness to be part of society and to work well with other people. The song is explicitly anti-conspiratorial, anti-conformity, but once again, it uses right-wing cliches to advocate for a leftist cause. So with all of this talk of like evil vaccines and big government bad, I should affirm that you should get vaccinated and you should get booster shots. It isn't conformity, it's common sense. You can't be a rebel if you're fucking dead, dummy. Hate the government for real reasons, oh my god. The chorus of the song turns from this initial meme chant to a call to leave society, you damn ape. It is the very point of the album, the main message that the audience is meant to take away, and people fucking loved it. And once again, the smallest violin should be played for bigots and the like, but that doesn't change the fact that this approach is devastatingly problematic. I'm going to give, as a gesture of good faith, I'm going to give two possible explanations that might let the band off the hook a little bit. So the first is like pretty simple. You probably thought of it immediately. The band aren't being serious. They cut everything they say in a healthy serving of irony, so projecting all of this eugenicist and determinist lingo onto them isn't fair because they're literally kidding. And I think that this is a weak retort. We have discussed this when we talked about meta-irony, but there is a literal element to all of the songs where Sebastian is very obviously joking. Theorists shouldn't literally live in the jungle. The song is vitriolic before it's actually prescriptive. Sebastian is writing about some previous faults he's had in his life, and he's lampooning them for being as asocial as they were. He openly says in interviews, and I think he's right, that theorists are wrong because they assign way too much certitude to the government, the cabal.
I don't think that my government is conspiring against me because I don't think that they're smart enough to. And also, like, and even if they were, I'm just like, I don't give a fuck, dude. Like, I'm all right. I've got an apartment. I've got some nice people in my life. There's enough to be upset about than making up shit to be upset about.
It's something that I expressed on this channel before. There is no one in the world who has more faith in the government's ability to do anything than the conspiracy theorist. Absolutely. But the thing is, there's no obvious indication to me that Sebastian is employing like an ironic use of right-wing cliches to make his audience think about how the rhetorical arguments are being twisted to meet alternative ends. The rhetorical device just isn't the same as it was with ironic misogyny. So the lyrics, although they're joking in their ultimate seriousness, they still assign conspiracy theorists and mass shooters to a literal lower level of consciousness and human worth. And I want you to take this on. I really wish more people would think about this. Just because we can agree with it in an abstract way doesn't mean it's wholly sound or valid, right? I spent so long talking about meta-irony because I fundamentally do not think that it applies to these tracks. So I think you need a better argument than don't take it seriously, he's just kidding. Because you can't be ironic about eugenics. It's that kind of apathy towards the material concerns of different races that is just as contemptible as actual racism is. Just because it's funny doesn't make it good. Secondly, Cave Wild talks frequently about attention deficit disorder, of which Sebastian has dealt with most of his life. And look, I'm pretty sure I have ADD. I've got ASD, and I've got depression. The juicy ass trifecta. I get it. I'm all about artists, talking about their mental health, their struggles with it, and how they circumvent it to create art. That's, it's admirable for a Viagra Boys song, whether it be the cognitive trade-off hypothesis or ADD, to be a touch vulnerable for a change. I like it. No critique. Do it again. But if I had, one thing to add to this album's rhetoric problem, it's petty, admittedly, but Sebastian has said in interviews that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he would leave lyrics up until the last minute, because his ADD has, quite relatably, made it difficult for him to write them earlier.
but I do need like in my band, at least I've got my bass player. He's always on my ass. Like, just write a fucking song. And I'll just be like, yeah. I'm gonna start writing. And then I don't start writing the song until like the last day in the studio. And we've got all the music done. And I've only got like 3 words. And then all of a sudden I'll write it in the last 10 minutes.
So, and I'm alleging this with the full knowledge that I am likely wrong. Mayhaps he wrote some of these lyrics about troglodytes and monkeys, but giving himself time to mull them over, because the demands of his bandmates and his recording schedules are incompatible with ADD. Capitalism does not accommodate neurodivergence. And I'm sure that this process worked out really well when he was writing about your loose uncle or whatever. But the theme here is so much more ambitious and so much more all-encompassing. And when it comes to something like that, I expect a bit more forethought and nuance. Frankly, a lot more. I don't have the book. The dawn of everything levels of more. Sure, the rhetoric might not be as cutting because bro might not have had the time to really consider every implication of every syllable. But that's not a good excuse either. You are responsible for your own mental well-being. And sure, we can blame capitalism for our own mental failings, but this is such a historically rich topic, and with such a wealth of things to discuss. And, it's really frustrating to me because it is handled with this lazy, disinterested hand. This album was hard to make, and all of the lyrics cohere into this one big idea, so I'm not saying that Seb or the band are lazy. That'd be really fucking stupid to say that's someone who makes art for a living, because I'm deeply respectful of artists. Ultimately exemplified in this clip of Sebastian where he does admit that he wrote Troglodyte, and then later, he looked up the song's namesake, and he found out that it doesn't specifically denote a prehistoric bugfish.
The song has a bunch of timeline errors, because when I first started writing it, I thought a troglodyte was one of those fossils you find in a rock. I was referencing someone being so far backwards that they're a fucking seashell, like they're the most primitive form of life. But then, I realized I was completely wrong. Troglodyte was a fucking caveman.
It's the trilobite that is meant to be swimming around in that lake. And fair enough, I didn't know those two things were different before I looked it up. But I didn't name a big song about mass shooters, evolution, and the violence of the human condition after something that I never really Googled. It's deeply incurious about these massive issues, and it is deeply frustrating to me as someone who is interested in those big issues. It is a massive problem on the record, this laissez-faire approach to these incredibly sensitive subjects, and they're handled with about as much grace as snorting a line of coke off someone's arse. It is awkward, and these topics should not be awkward. We went from a wholesome story about a lovesick loose unit, and now we have all of these messy retorts to these huge existential issues. It's an insane amount of whiplash, and I want to stress once again, because there are going to be some people who are determined to misunderstand me, I do think that the band has pure and honest intentions behind their work. This isn't a dog whistle for the right wing. This isn't secret code. It's closer to an unfortunate implication, like that Folgers incest commercial. Oh my fucking god, you really didn't think that one through, did you? But this is why we study rhetoric. To think through the implications of words before we sell them on vinyl records. I want to touch on something that you might have noticed the absence of. This punk band rarely, if ever, addresses the subject of class. The types of people that they write about on Ain't No Thief and Big Boy are often subtextually implied to be working class in origin. Ain't Nice has the protagonist not having his own place and hoarding technology in case he can sell them for big bucks someday. And Big Boy is about the vapidness of consumerism and finding personal validation through it. Sebastian is also pretty open about his history of being a drug addict, and having to scramble to sustain himself, a sentiment explored on the track Creatures from Welfare Jazz, where those at the bottom of society have to scramble to get by, selling copper to fund their habits because they can't go to systemic sources for help. There is a unity between those who live underwater, but it doesn't really go into detail past collecting copper. The album being called Welfare Jazz, and then it's being about how a poor man has to improvise his way back into someone's love after he loses it, is a pretty clever name for a record, but it doesn't exactly deal with welfare very much outside of the needs and crimes of drug users. I find it curious that class only factors into their lyrics when they relate to drugs or being a bit of a shitty person. And I'm not You know, I'm in favor of drug decriminalization. I think it's a very good cause and we should fight towards it. But I think that's a bit weird, is all I'm saying. And the reason why I feel like that is because the topic of class kind of colours the very ending of Cave World, and it's done quite elegantly. As the chaos of Return to Monkey simmers down, we get some spoken word telling us the story of an office building in Japan where a violent murder took place. The content of this story is disinterested in the emotions of the murder, the horror, the blood involved of having someone have their head cut off. But the tone is reassuring and firm, like a trusted newscaster. They removed the carpet and cleaned the furniture at a most remarkable speed. It's been a good day. Which is something that you should never say when someone has had their head cut off at work. The subtext is that of fluidity and capital. The murder was an obstruction, and the workers were able to get back to work with minimal disruption. And being denied the emotional reality of that prompts the audience to ask some very weird questions. Is this a troglodyte situation where someone just went postal? The murder was disregarded and we aren't supposed to grieve because grieving would interrupt work and give power to the beheader? Is this meant to accentuate how pathetic the beheader is, that they couldn't even properly interrupt a full workday with all of their hatred and rage? It's left a bit ambiguous, and my takeaway certainly leans towards it being anti-capitalist in nature, but this is basically the only explicit mention of class on Cave World, and that's weird when you're talking about conspiracy theories, racism, and prickish human beings. As we'll get into soon, there is a strong relationship between fearism and capital that is fascinating to dissect. But it isn't acknowledged here because the bent of the record is that fearists are inhuman idiots. To me, one of the most curious things about this whole affair is how it has been, uncritically accepted and celebrated by music critics and audiences abroad. I looked really hard to see if anyone had critiqued it as I have, and there's nothing. Some people didn't like the ironic misogyny, some people didn't like the seedy vibe, but that's most of the legitimate criticism. Rather, you have people like the Needle Drop who are like, haha! Yes! This is what's wrong with society. My fill when this explains the human condition.
I do think it is getting across some of the most essential points I've heard any album bring to the table this year.
This is not a subtle album. This is going straight after people. This is talking about school shooters. This is talking about small-minded trolls on the internet. It's talking about the things you actually see. But we need this, okay? There's not enough people actually talking about what's actually happening right now because it's too passé.
You really do kind of deal with some people out there that are kind of missing a DNA strand or two. And seemingly the internet has given many of these individuals the power to collectivize and voice their crazy, insane ideas in a very loud and sometimes dangerous way. Yeah, in terms of that, I think Viagra Boy is really hitting the nail on the head with this one.
I know this is the second time I've gone at Fantano in within a year or so. I don't dislike him. I don't really have a problem with him apart from his 2015 anti-feminist edgelord phase, but he's addressed it, and I do feel like that we should allow people grace and character development. But why is this concept, the use of right-wing rhetoric, but woke, so appealing to those who agree with it? Why isn't it rejected as emphatically and forcefully as outright racism is? Well, the simple answer to that is whiteness. Colonialism being ingrained into white people, so they aren't critical about how whiteness underlays assumptions about animals and different races and such. But I want to go more into the rhetoric side of things. I really hope someone makes a video about that because it would be fucking awesome. Because it's all well and good to criticize something, but I demand nuance. And since no one else has talked about this, it falls to me to do all of the discourse myself. Finally, I want to reiterate that I don't hate the band or anyone who likes them. You're all media literate people. You get that I'm being quite generous with my words here. And there will be some silly billies out there who take any perceived slight on a piece of media that they like as a personal assassination of their own character. Morality as consumption. There is nothing wrong with liking Viagra Boys, but I subscribe to the school of being critical of the things you like. And I think that we should be critical of the ways in which we can accept faulty premises from people that we mostly agree with. I'm going to define my three biggest problems of Cave World as follows. Biological determinism, inhuman conspiracism, and shitty internet satire. Chapter 4, Taxonomy of a Problematic Lyric. By the way, I'm pro-monkey. Some people hate them with a fiery passion. I like them. They make funny noises. I like their tails.
I like it when they do like the cognitive trade-off hypothesis type thing. Makes me feel like deeply inadequate as an autistic person who can barely comprehend maths. I wish I had like a useful type of autism, you know? Like I just read into slightly problematic lyrics and make video essays. While like my kinsmen, they're over there like building bridges and like doing economy. Monkeys. I like monkeys, they're cool. Is the point. Stripping away like the pretense, I do think that there is a conversation to be had about returning to monkey. Like, I'm of the belief that we should be more aware of our own innate animal tendencies. Like, our brains are electrified goop that by some cosmic accident invented interest rates and the banality of evil. The experience, like the first person experience of consciousness is deeply weird, and there is this comfort in imagining the simplicity of the brains of our ancestors. You know that popular type of meme where someone yells at a picture of our crop cultivating ancestors and they're like, "Stop farming! No! Return to your hunter-gatherer lifestyle, because now I have to pay rent!" It's mostly in jest. And it expresses angst about the modern world, problems that society that weren't present back then. But first of all, when we look at technology and how it has ultimately improved our lives, you're not going to give up the complicated benefits of school or Google just to starve and pick berries in the woods. Not really. You know? Secondly, and more critically, the meme treats our ancestors of the Neolithic Revolution as if they weren't human. That, like, their brain chemistry was just simpler than ours, and they were blissfully ignorant of our problems. My bros from the agricultural revolution practicing animal husbandry and struggling to light fires were still depressed. They still felt small, suicidal, and anxious on occasion. They just saw those emotions as different. Proper bicameral mind hypothesis type shit. The fact of the matter is that, like, 10 to 12,000 years is not long enough for natural selection and evolution to fundamentally change the essential structures of the animal brain into, like, a different species. The citizens of Mesopotamia didn't know about fucking Netflix and how the streaming model might make the institution of cinema collapse, but they still perform mathematics, ethics, and they shared the same feelings and angst that we do. If you were to drop a hunter-gatherer into modern times, it wouldn't take them that long to adjust because we share the same essential cognitive function of them. We share a psychic unity. Given enough time and help, the hunter-gatherer could make an amazing little movie for Netflix. The impulse is meant to be a joke, but a joke isn't funny. A meme isn't funny if there are addendums and appendixes underneath because it robs the punch of the joke itself. I don't know, dude. Like, I hope I don't come across as a meme cop in this video because I love to chortle and I love to giggle at my phone late at night when I should be sleeping. Like, I laughed at Harambe like all of you goddamn heathens. It's just that, like, I have a tendency to overthink jokes until they're not funny anymore. It's called autism, babe. Catch up. Memes are funny, but they are inherently a reductive medium, just like a song. And I'm not saying that you can only do discourse good, but if you write books. But when it comes to very big issues, they require increasingly girthsome answers. And social media incentivizes us to say as little as we can, with as few words as possible, because that is the most profitable to corporations and advertisers. More posts, more money. Systemic analysis is boring, but it's funny to call someone a pedophile, or to Photoshop a media personality you already disagree with having pissed his genes. It gets the point across faster, and it's viscerally funnier than giving a tedious, girthsome history of American eugenics and how they influenced the Nazis. People won't stop for a microsecond to look at that shit. So, basing a song off of a meme, primarily because you thought it would go hard at shows, infringes upon your ability to create nuanced criticisms of the problem that you're trying to sing about, because the source is inherently reductive. We will return to this subject later on, but first, we actually have to confront what was so appealing about this core argument first. So why do people like using right-wing cliches with leftist verbiage? And I want to answer that in the most boring way possible by talking about a study I once read. There is a famous study looking at the biological reactions of liberals and conservatives. They took a brain scan of these openly partisan people and they showed them various news articles. Here's an article of Obama doing another drone bombing. Here's Trump failing at another business. Watch as they both giggle over the death of Palestinian kids. And the study found that conservatives were a bit more likely to have activity in their amygdalas when they were hearing news they disagreed with, indicating that they have larger right-side amygdalas than liberals. Now, I do have a big problem with this study, that being the outrageously small sample size of 35 people. Not 350. 35 individuals. It's not even an even number. If nothing else, it's like a decent starting point, and if the study was to do it on like hundreds of thousands of people, it could be quite interesting. But I sincerely and deeply wish that people would internalize and practice that just because you agree with something, just because something tickles your brain, doesn't mean that it's right and that you should say it. Those are two very different things, because in my own anecdotal experience, I have seen leftists take this study, ignore its obvious weaknesses, and use it as this meme and a cudgel to tear down those they already disagree with. Like, I've seen communists, he, theys, and she's cackle and celebrate this study because it proves that conservatives have chemically worse off brains than them. Personally, I find it really gross and reductive that so-called egalitarians use this study with such glee, and I play the world's smallest violin for the racists and the transphobes in the world. They are narrow-minded, and their tacit reinforcement of dangerous societal norms are wrong. But they're not narrow-minded because of their amygdalas. But there is this part of me that completely understands why leftists jump on this train, because it is actually pretty satisfying to look at a bigot and use their own words against them. But why is that exactly? What does that impulse mean about us rhetorically? So to explain that, I want to share something that happened in my life while I was writing this video. So at my day job, I have this co-worker who I both adore as a person and am deeply frustrated by. He's like a second dad to me, but he's every flavor of problematizing. Yeah, he was the kind of old fellow who used the classic, "Why are you politicizing tragedies?" whenever mass shootings would happen in America, even though we have gun control in Australia. I think that leftists spend a lot of time tearing down the humanity of bigots, not without fault, mind you. But when you have to work with one several times a week, and it's just the two of you alone on a remote property, you have to develop some strategy for getting along. Like, for your own mental health and stress levels, if nothing else. I acknowledge that this is certainly a privileged perspective to have about this issue because I'm a white and cis man, and hateful things are not usually said about me. Usually. Gay marriage was a bit of a hard time. I can choose not to talk about capitalism and race, but if I were to have more melanin in my skin, I couldn't lighten my pigmentation, so our getting along would be different. But the point is, a mutual friend of ours, someone who lives down the road, got really sick. Without going into insensitive details, he had health issues for years, but according to the doctor's clinical opinion, the cause was likely a booster shot that he got 6 months prior, right? It's really sad. He is a very nice old man. He's always been kind to me, and my coworker became really incensed over this. Full of rage and worry, he just would not stop ranting for days. The vaccines were supposed to protect us, and now he's going to die, he said. The government did this, and now he's going to die. And my first impulse to argue against him was to say, why are you politicizing tragedies? Now, I fought this. I didn't say it because situationally it was kind of a fucked up thought to have, considering that we've both known our neighbor for the better part of a decade. It tasted of bad faith to essentially use his mortal illness as a chess piece towards my own belief in the utility and safety of vaccines. My thought was, my friend, you've obviously latched onto the vaccine thing to fill with your feelings of grief over our neighbor potentially dying. But even if I didn't know our neighbor personally, say, for instance, that we were just talking about someone on the internet who went through the same thing, this is still a really bad argument to make. It doesn't defend the concept of herd immunity, it doesn't address the utilitarian nature of the benefits that vaccines give us, and it neglects to acknowledge that they are some of the greatest inventions in human history. It doesn't even engage with vaccines as a concept of all. That argument that I thought about was a dagger. It was a dagger, and I was twisting his own words, which were originally from a hateful context. His apathy and complacency with innocent Kiwi Muslims getting slaughtered by an Australian Nazi. And I was using them to hurt him back. It was vengeance, giving him a dose of its own medicine. It isn't an effective argument rhetorically, but it sure was satisfying to think. The argument goes a little bit like this. You're a white supremacist. Well, you simply have a larger amygdala than I do. Your chemical fear reaction makes your opinion less valid. So much for white supremacy. You said that we shouldn't politicize mass shootings, and yet here you are politicizing your friend's illness. You are by implication a cherry-picking hypocrite, and your argument is wrong, lol. Both of these arguments are wrong, precisely because they don't actually engage with politics, and they look to dismiss opposition outright. That's why they're used extensively by the right, because their arguments in favor of the status quo aren't persuasive. They're bad arguments used maliciously, but people fall for them again and again because it is viscerally satisfying to look at a bigot in the eye and to use their own rhetoric against them. And it's so satisfying that you don't even consider that you are doing right-wing politics but woke, validating their own premises implicitly. There's a meme that goes viral every now and again. It's in response to an anti-Christopher Columbus video from a Native American perspective. The indigenous lady has her middle finger up and she says, "Fuck Christopher Columbus." Iconic. A comment under the video reads, "They were refugees looking for a better life, bringing diversity and inclusion. Don't be a bigot." If you can see what is wrong with this comment, how it has reduced the legacy of Native American genocide and colonialism and any number of things by choosing that still image of her cursing the genocide man, and if you can critique how bad faith it is, don't do the same fucking thing but woke, dude. It isn't better when you do it because you aren't actually making a point. You are just dunking for the sake of it. You are validating faulty premises to make someone look bad rather than having to actually think of an actual argument that believes in something. I implore you, do not validate this ghoulish goulash, because as a critical thinker, I think you should rise above it instead of falling down to it. That's why I believe Troglodyte and Return to Monkey have been accepted uncritically. It is revenge and catharsis for every school shooter, every conspiracist uncle, every ignorant lowlife that you've ever met, along with, like, whiteness colonialism and, not thinking very hard about the media that you consume. It's totally missing the forest for the trees, and it reinforces the idea that evolutionary psychology and bioessentialism are the conversations that we should be having in the first place. It dismisses actual social problems because people are biologically disposed to their wrong beliefs and actions. You don't have to make a good or persuasive argument in a good or persuasive way. The biological factor itself devalues the person you disagree with. Instead of engaging with nuanced arguments like capitalism alienating people and forcing workers to compete against each other, and the workplace being monotonous and making people resentful, along with the fact that masculinity stifles feelings and compels men to lash out with violence as an act of self-validation, and then also the 24-hour news cycle encouraging and rewarding infamy, and these pathetic people see this as their ticket out of their pathetic life and their chance to be forever regarded as a bad motherfucker, and also guns being pretty easy to get in a lot of these societies because there is a vested capitalist interest in selling guns to as many people as possible, amongst a dozen other things. Instead, it's all biology. It's polygenics, and it is religious, in the sense that there is an unambiguous Nietzschean good and evil. We reduce and we condense complicated systemic issues into biology so that we don't have to face those systemic issues, and so that we don't actually have to change anything right now. It is exactly along the same lines as when politicians blame video games or movies for mass shootings. It is a misdirection away from the thing that actually needs solving. Using biological determinism makes you disregard actions because they were always going to happen. So there's no reason to stop them even when you should, because it'll just happen somewhere else. Well, paradoxically, the same line of logic is used to enslave and control non-white people because they are believed to be incapable of controlling themselves. And you know what? It feels pretty good to be the bigot for a change, to dish out all of the horrible shit that they inflict on other people. But that's stooping to their level. You are allowing this existential human issue to become a matter of biological determinism rather than human experience, empathy, and actually facing institutional problems head on. You cannot defeat conservatism by doing conservative rhetoric but woke. There are some types of rhetoric that should be dissolved rather than solved, and Troglodyte is a stellar example of that. Viagra boys, and by extension Devo, misunderstand evolution itself because proper Darwinian evolution concludes that de-evolution is linguistically and mechanically impossible. You cannot devolve because evolution is not the process of improvement, of gaining a better brain with higher microbits per second or getting some sick new claws. Evolution is the process of change over time. A species can adapt more to an environment, get a better beak to get at a juicy grub stuck deep in a branch, and consequently survive the drought. But the mutations that do occur happen randomly, and they just so happen to give the animal an edge over their competitors. That isn't by design, it is definitionally coincidence. In misunderstanding how evolution works, they fall into right-wing talking points that are inadvertently about people, and that is very disappointing. It's worth taking a moment to consider whether or not the whole conspiratorial angle of Cave World is flawed in a mundane sense as well as rhetorically. There is the question of the conspiracy theories, the talk of adrenochrome and whatnot, if they're so specific to our time period that the album might not age well. That's the argument by the Pitchfork Review, one of the very few professional publications of the record that wasn't full of glowing praise. If the merits of capital S satire might be judged by locating it on a spectrum ranging from prescience to disposability, one might ask, will this project continue to engage or enrage audiences 25 years from now? What about 5? Viagra Boys ripped from the headlines caricature sketches, a better time to get you through the afternoon. Only time will tell as to whether or not these queries hold water, but I don't fully agree with it. Because punk has always been very contemporary. The Dead Kennedys wrote one of their most beloved songs, California Uber Alice, about the then governor of California. Green Day wrote about the Bush administration on American Idiot. Hell, one of the most iconic songs in punk history, God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols, is erroneously regarded to be about Elizabeth II's then Silver Jubilee. That's an urban myth. The band just so happened to denigrate the Queen around the time of the event. Are these songs dated? Sure, without a doubt. Are they still resonant? Yes, absolutely. Both because they stand for a time and place, but also because shit doesn't change. It still feels relevant to today. Punk is necessarily reactionary. It was a social movement made in organic response to the policies of Thatcher, Reagan, and by association the Friedman School of Economics. Neoliberalism. So to worry that these lyrics will age badly as if they are merely referencing modern C-tier commercials is redundant because neoliberalism is here to stay and the internet is now the standard. And commenting upon how it has changed our lives and our relationship to politics will be resonant in the future. Just like the wheel on the AR-15. You can't uninvent the internet. Sure, people in 2040 might not remember what adrenochrome is, and they might groan over certain pieces of slang in the same way that we cringe over MLG gaming memes circa 2014.
Alright, so I was looking for some MLG gaming memes circa 2014, and I had this lightning bolt memory. So when I was in high school, when I was in year 10, my drama teacher, the guy who filled in while my drama teacher was sick for a while, his name was Mr. Brown, and late into my year 10, he starred in a salmon ad. And the boys found out about it at the school, and they basically bullied him out of the school by making shit like this. Like, we've just gotta watch it. It's deeply bizarre. I hope Mr. Brown is having a good day. He did a very good job in this ad.
Oh, fucking hell, I was in high school a decade ago. Oh, that's fun to think about right now. But people in the future will be aware of the blood libel, and the ways that anti-Semitism has and continues to underscore and inform the structure of conspiracy theories, especially because we now have 24 access to genius lyrics on Wikipedia. So with all of that in mind, and my belief in the value of exploring conspiracism in song intact, let's talk about Pizzagate.
Edgar Welch, 28 of Salisbury, North Carolina, has been arrested and charged with assault with a dangerous weapon. And police say that Welch told them that he showed up at the D.C. pizza restaurant to get to the bottom of what appears to be an utterly bogus story about child abuse promoted on the internet.
If you don't already know, a man entered a pizza parlor with an AR-15 because he read online that Democrats like Hillary Clinton were running a secret pedophilic sex trafficking ring out of the basement. So he stormed the building with a gun and he found that there was no basement in the building. Thankfully, no one was hurt, and it's generally funny to look at the event back now to point and laugh at the delusional nature of those you disagree with. But, and this might be a spicy take, there is a growing sentiment amongst authors and commentators that the Pizzagate shooter, Mr. Welch, wasn't wrong. In the specific sense that if you truly believe that a restaurant in your general area was harboring a secret pedophilic ring, that taking a gun to free the kids is morally the right thing to do. Delusional as he was he not well-intentioned? And, you know, don't get it twisted, he was a lunatic, but the impulse pedophilia and sex trafficking is bad isn't wrong, we can all agree on that. But there's one thing that I disagree with your political scientists and cultural commentators when it comes to Pizzagate. And it's that this attempted shooting was not bipartisan in nature, fueled by this apolitical desire to protect kids from those who wish to prey upon them. But Welch wasn't angry at, child predators generally going unpunished. Not at all. He heard a conspiratorial rumor about a group of people he already didn't like, and then he decided that he would be a hero to take down the people of whom he already didn't like. The problem with Pizzagate wasn't that it was delusional alone. It's that it was adopted by right-wing news outlets, and this adoption normalized incredibly dangerous conspiracy theories into the mainstream in a way that hadn't been seen before, because it was politically and rhetorically useful to those in power, laying the very groundwork and the political utility for QAnon amongst many other things. I cannot stress to you enough that these theories were adopted by those in the White House, in Trump's recently elected office. And this normalized extremist rhetoric in such a way that it formed a stepping stone towards QAnon and the Capitol riots. Not the first, not the only one, but it was a very important step nonetheless. The theory was originally conceived and used to slander Hillary Clinton, not because she was a contemptible neoliberal shill, but because she was a leftist enemy, and all leftists are pedophiles because anyone I disagree with is a pedophile. They are biologically, neurochemically, psychologically, morally beneath consideration. And this itself is a very complicated phenomenon, and it's difficult to communicate the scope of the issue within the medium of a video essay. Not all conservatives do it, but the people Sebastian are addressing do, and we have to take it seriously because that impulse fucking minimizes actual child abuse. When you invent child rape orgies, where children are abused in order to harvest adrenochrome, the comparatively mundane abuse between a father and daughter is unspectacular. Your buddy who makes your daughter uncomfortable when he's around, even less so. He's not so bad, darling. Just look at the Clintons. The impulse to disregard anyone you disagree with as a pedophile has serious tactical utility in the conservative mind, and it is by design devoid of nuance. There aren't shades of grey to the issue. They are the bad guys because they are perverts, and we are good guys because we hate perverts, and I can never be a bad guy because I am we and we are us. These deeply dishonest memes have distorted thought and ideologies into simple us versus them worldviews, devoid of nuance, abstaining from giving a fuck. And this can happen to us on the left, so we ought to figure out how it works so that we can recognize it within our own communities. It is a symptom of rhetoric becoming distorted, memeified, weaponized rather than being used to inform, educate, or to give honest assessment. And this is why I think memes are inherently an inhuman and incognitive medium to do politics through. It is deeply fucked up that this is the world we live in now. It's also why I'm so critical of... I've done lots of meme readings in this video because we have to be critical of this shit. It's how we do our politics now, and it's deeply fucking scary to me. The other problem with KVOD is that it assumes that the conspiratorial is inhuman, that conspiracy theorists are just so crazy that they are beyond the world of the sane and they ought not to be listened to at all. I think this is wrong in a Foucauldian sense. Madness is not garbled nonsense. The mad are intensely logical people, but we can't make out the patterns, so we label them inhuman. But primarily, I strongly and firmly believe that to be a conspiracy theorist is to be intensely human. I've talked about this a lot on this channel, where Tacitus, the great Roman historian, reported that during the great fires of Rome, citizens came up with conspiracy theories about who actually started the fires. Nero burned down the city just to get a sick statue of himself. Or maybe he wanted to persecute the Christians. Or maybe someone left a candle lit and it caused a fire. That belief isn't as exciting as the former two, is it? There are also plenty of accounts of the Great Fires of London, which show the same things. Well poisoning and blood libel accusations were anti-Semitic projections of conspiratorial activity done to spite Christ. And that's been happening for well over 2,000 years. Well, 1,000 years. Well poisoning and blood libel only really became popular in about the year 1200. Those in power have always been accused of engaging in extravagant and gluttonous activities, such as the nature of power and serfdom. This is gonna be some base level, right? Conspiracism happens when you get more than 3 people together, right? 1 person scheming against you is a plot. 2 is a conspiracy. Definitionally. It has always been here, and it will always be part of ourselves that we have to struggle against. I deal with conspiratorial thoughts. I just so happen to be a bit more self-aware of them now that I've done all of this research. And I do get the sentiment of Troglodyte and Return to Monkey, that there are certain types of behavior that are antisocial, destructive, antithetical to process, and the mass shooters and 4chan neo-Nazis do deserve ridicule. But this is a really bad way to go about it, because this insistent on the record. You're no ape, you're a troglodyte. Leave society, be a monkey. That these people are incorrect because of their inhumanity is wrong. The problem with conspiracy theorists is not that they are reactionary and delusional alone. It's that being reactionary and delusional makes them a marketable demographic, right? That it just so happens that they're politically useful to market towards for money, votes, free labor to harass your political rivals. Conspiracy theories can be organic. QAnon was likely born from a random bored 4chan user, but it was adopted and perpetrated by people who discovered the community, saw that they were gullible, and were easy to sway politically. And I don't mean for this to come across as a defense of conspiracy theorists. Ooh, small beans that they are. I have spent more time than I care to admit criticizing them. 2 full-length series worth of time. When you believe that politics is corruption, that politics only functions to distribute corruption, to evoke historian Timothy Snyder, you become complacent with actual corruption. They did an embezzlement. That's what the government do. We can justify corruption when our side does it because that's just politics, baby. A perfect excuse to let the people you like win and to tear down the ones that you don't. Conservatives don't disregard the rules, they selectively apply them to get their way. As a conspiracy theorist, you relinquish the ability to fight for a better world, because what you actually are is not a freethinker, not a shepherd pointing the flock in the right direction, but a complacent citizen who is fundamentally in favor of the status quo perpetuating itself. Theorists and punk share one common flaw, and that is repressive desublimation, a Marxist psychoanalytic term that denotes the process of complacency. You have a tough day at work, you let off some steam by playing violent video games at home, you forget how oppressed you are by consuming a product, and then you go to work the next day as a more complacent worker. What Marcuse describes is obviously more complicated than that. He's not saying that we would certainly have socialism already if we had not invented Robin Hood books and crime movies. But I argue, in my Conspiracism series, that this impulse deeply informs the first-person experience of conspiracy theories. Theorists channel their anxieties about the rich into absurd stories about people they don't like abusing babies to gain eternal youth. And they become more complacent with actual child abuse because the severity of it has become exaggerated in their own minds. And it's the same with punk. It is one of the most classic examples. You join punk because it's vaguely anti-authority rather than its intrinsic countercultural tendencies and its grounding in genuine concern for human well-being. You listen to punk records, you go to shows, you get all of your aggression out of the system, and then you go back to work the next day as a more complacent worker. But at least you aren't like the normies because you can pronounce the word proletariat. And I'm not saying that you're a fake punk if you aren't a communist, because I have a hell of a lot of problems with complacent communists as well. Wait for the fucking next episode, dude. Holy shit. I'm just saying that when you channel the vague sense of anti-authority in your guts, divorced from critiques of capital and institutions, you turn into those ghouls who danced to rage against the machine while wearing Trump Blue Lives Matter flags, fueled only by a vague sense of countercultural rebellion. I'm sorry, dude, this is what happens when you reduce punk down to counterculture, and you are ignorant enough to believe that social media-driven movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too are hegemonic, even though they categorically are not. You interpret the reactionary nature of punk through the lens of rightist reactionary politics. Conservatives is the new punk, I'm not allowed to say the N-word. That's the logic, but it is in profound and obsessive misunderstanding of the culture and art that they dance to. Sure, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and sure, punk has not really changed the status quo all that much, but the point of making political art is to challenge people's assumptions about governance and power, to create more informed and curious citizens. I'm sorry. You get into punk because you give a fuck about the world, not because you are so detached from the reality of politics that you just sit back and critique it and change nothing. And one of my biggest problems with Viagra Boys is that they seem to have political opinions. They're socialist in some vague sense, but they seem so detached from the world under this guise of irony that their politics come across as apathetic and a bit nihilistic. The world's fucked, humanity is fucked, there's nothing we can do about it, so we should just look out for our own. I'm a bit like the Toxic Man in my songs, but I got mine, so I'm fine. This album just isn't interested in change, because change would mean having to make the world better for everyone. It would mean accountability. And they just kind of want to watch the world as it burns, with this hearty dash of cocaine and beer in their round tattooed bellies. Under this philosophy, you take the position of a bystander with a lot of objections, but no praxis, no will to change anything. You jack off because that would lead you vulnerable and accountable. Conspiracy theorists are a marketing demographic of exploited human beings. I implore you, be mad at the exploiters for creating the conditions of their relevance as much as you're upset about the absurd claims. Why do I have so many books? What the fuck's wrong with me? I need to take up, like, knitting. Knitting would be great. I could just, like, knit some shit. I'd probably be more satisfied than having to, like, do this for hundreds of hours. I love my life. It's like it's past 12 o'clock. Sebastian has said that among his favorite YouTube channels are Internet Comment Etiquette with Eric and Channel 5 of Andrew Callahan. Their YouTube videos are so similar to the levels of commentary on Cave World. They share a lot of the same motifs and idioms, and they even have a similar nihilistic sense of humor. Also, both channels extensively deal with conspiracy theories and deeply absurd rhetoric in order to mine entertainment and ultimately comedy from them. It's also a well-known bit of trivia that Creepy Crawlers got its title from a Channel 5 video.
What are creepy crawlers?
It's things with tentacles, and they like try to move together. It's like they're a family of satanic little particles.
And I just like, all right, I'm taking that. I'm putting that into a song.
And finally, here's a photo of the boys with Eric. So that's enough for me to justify a brief investigation. Full disclosure, I've been a fan of Internet Comment Etiquette since like 2017. I don't watch him as much anymore, but there is at least like a sixth of my entire sense of humor owed to his videos. Like, an early prototype of my Port Arthur series was going to feature Internet Comment Etiquette style interjections where I would harass theorists in that movement, but because of reasons stated below, soon to be pronounced, I decided that would go against the analysis that I was trying to conduct. I love that man so much. I wish he was my dad. Now, I've never watched Channel 5, but I did watch the documentary This Place Rules in early 2023, and that was pretty good. Fantastic, even. The allegations against Andrew that shortly thereafter came out were very serious, upsetting, and supremely disappointing. This keeps happening to me. I discover something, I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. I recently revisited Velocity, Design, and Comfort by Sweet Trip, the shoegaze IDM album from 2003, and I was like, oh man, this album's great. I wonder what the band is up to. oh no! Crazy fucking story. Ooh, this keeps happening to me, basically. So my own analysis here will be based upon my knowledge of these two properties. They have done so many videos about so many different things that I'm going to, limit myself to things actually mentioned in Cave World. Primarily, vaccines and adrenochrome. I don't feel the need to explain what adrenochrome is, as you are likely already familiar with it. So how does Big Money Salvia talk about this incredibly controversial topic? So controversial that I should note that the song Creepy Crawlies was removed from YouTube for violating YouTube's guidelines. Itself funny, even though it's very obviously a piece of purposeful satire. It's kind of a meme in the Viagra Boys fandom. Whole can of worms, that thing. Eric starts his video off by drinking bottles of what he calls adrenochrome in the video, chugging it as much as he usually chugs wine. Obviously making fun of the conspiratorial belief that celebrities chug the drug like no tomorrow, but it works as a joke because Eric isn't a celebrity. My jaundiced adult dad has a moderately successful YouTube channel, and has been on 2 episodes of It's Always Sunny, both times as extras. The paratextual implication is that, if he can get it, then how closely guarded of a secret can it actually be? The next motif in the video is highlighting the paranoia of the theorists with these little segments where he replies to conspiratorial posts on X. He replies with this video of himself in a deep voice proclaiming, "Cease your investigations," a channel catchphrase. There is no moment where you see if anyone replied to this, but the video is framed as only you, the theorist, can see this. So these two motifs, undermining the ease of access at which one acquires the drug and then the heightening of paranoia, are both within Creepy Crawly's lyrics. The protagonist of that song has discovered this deep secret of adrenochrome, easily just by googling it, and the song reads as this stream of consciousness rambling of a neurotic paranoiac. The band lets the rambling and disparately disconnected points speak for themselves, as they are both so absurd that they hang themselves over their own noose. And this is a pretty common tactic when it comes to making comedy about conspiracy theorism, because the absurdity is funnier than any joke that you can write, unless that is, you talk about the Spanish play. In that case, you can just talk about that shit all day long, you know what I mean? This can be a good persuasive strategy for convincing non-theorists and those on the fence not to listen to theorists. Eric is essentially making an argument from cringe here. By refraining from mocking every single line, you allow the totality of the content's absurdity to really hit the audience, and they gain this aversion to the material overall. One thing about Creepy Crawlies that is brilliant, intentional or not, is the song is so experimental with its winding structure, its seemingly improvised grooves, and its fevered, sporadic delivery, that it isn't exactly catchy. A casual listener, say someone who actually thinks adrenochrome is consumed by the barrel by Democrats, isn't likely to find this song and then vibe with it because it's so abstract and weird. It gets around the satire paradoxes of a song like Killing in the Name by Rage Against the Machine, which we mentioned earlier. The piece is explicitly anti-cop and anti-racist. It is literally the opening couplet, and that couplet takes up a pretty significant percentage of the song. But the song is still enjoyed by cops and racists because the track murders in the pit. It's easy to ignore the propaganda if the guitar goes crazy. Creepy Crawlies is so weird that it isn't attractive, and you're forced to engage with the sporadic and bizarre nature of the lyrics. There's no chance that someone will, could take it seriously because everything is just so absurd. I'm not saying that Creepy Crawlies is better satire than Killing in the Name either. Rage are iconic. Bloody Evil Empire is an all-timer for me, for sure. But Creepy Crawlies is less likely to be misinterpreted. And while I commend the track for that, this combative cringe-addled strategy isn't actually very good at convincing theorists to not be conspiratorial, because conspiracy theorists are actually quite insecure about their belief. So when they feel like someone is mocking them, they shut down all critical thinking abilities and go straight into attack mode. So putting little comedy bits directly insulting theorists in your ethnographic debunking series doesn't really work, because you want to convince people to leave the movements that you're ethnographing, and you can't do that by mocking them. So Creepy Crawlies is satire, but it isn't cutting or effective satire. It simply gestures at an absurd straw man and asks you to laugh at it. It's funny, it's absurd, it reflects something real and current, but it doesn't do anything with it. It doesn't engage with why people believe these things, and I'm not even expecting a methodical history of anti-Semitism in my Viagra Boys song. I would be deeply afraid if they tried, frankly. But the gesture isn't enough to make good satire. Like, The Boys isn't a great show just because it has a bad sex pervert Superman. That's overdone and stale. Instead, the show interrogates capitalism itself, the mundane and inhuman realities of marketing and public relations. The reality of marketing superheroes in a similar way that Marvel and DC do. By the way, Season 2 is literally a metaphor for how American eugenics influenced Nazism.
It's called white genocide.
That's what it's about. They did their homework, and it's really fucking good. The show is so good at what it does that a vocal minority of dumbasses actually harass the stars over the same things that the show criticizes. Hashtag Erin Moriarty did nothing wrong. Hashtag media literacy is dead. Now I'm going to talk about Channel 5, which I've just discovered has started posting again back in October, which I find that a bit distasteful given the severity of the allegations against the host, but I can't control anything they do. I couldn't possibly cover the entirety of what they do, nor that I really want to, so I'm going to discuss the film they released in 2023. And before you write your shitty little comment below, yes, I hear you. I know that Cave World was written and released before the film came out. I'm a dumbass, that's why I have to read all these books, but I'm aware of that fact. Yes, you're very clever. But this is my channel, and I can do what I want. Dude, start giving me money on Patreon and then we can have a serious conversation about what you think. And I'll even pretend to care. The film does some things differently from the YouTube videos that are worth highlighting. Most of the YouTube stuff isn't strictly political. They just center bizarre people saying political things, if that makes sense. Channel 5, with their brass balls and silent mouths, just allow people to say crazy stuff, and not dissimilar to how Eric does it, they allow people to hang themselves with a noose of their own absurdity. The channel attracts the kind of audience that believes that this is like the real America, in such a way that what Andrew and the gang are doing are akin to actual journalism. I don't think it's necessarily groundbreaking. Like, conspiracy theorists have always been with us. We talked about this in the last segment, but like, With the internet, they're just more visible now than they ever have been before. Theorists used to attend conferences and convene around coffee tables. Now they openly express their paranoia online for everyone to see. But This Place Rules is mainly about the January 6 riots, the pressure leading up until and the reaction to it. And that is without doubt something fascinating to dissect within a context like this. I have seen some criticism of the film by leftists who call the movie centrist. They platform young communists and allow them to say, talk about their drugs and tearing down the government. And these kids are eccentric, sure, but they are nothing in comparison to the older conservative Gen 6 truthers. The film is clearly sympathetic to leftists, but it pokes a bit of fun at them because the political situation that they exist within is absurd. I'm sorry, if you can't laugh at yourself at how absurd politics can be sometimes, then you are a boring person. With the movie, there's lots to comment on. The zoomer editing heightening the comedy of every absurd claim, the surreal segment where Andrew drinks whiskey with Alex Jones and lift weights. But there are two moments that I want to highlight in this analysis. The first are these little interview bits where Andrew speaks directly to camera. His whole shtick is to remain silent when, quote, interviewing his subjects. He rarely asks questions or interjects. So these moments allow him to speak directly to the viewer and to give him his honest, considered opinion. He makes a great point towards the end of the movie that I've thought about quite a fair bit, where he comments upon, the outrageous privilege the January 6 protesters have, where they clearly have, enough money to fuck off to Washington for a couple of weeks just to LARP as protesters. Which is, a deeply outrageous thing because of the legacy of America's actual attempted and exposed conspiracies. They're all on my desk, can't be bothered picking them up right now. The assassination of Black Panther's Fred Hampton, the syphilis experiments in Tuskegee, the works of Gary Webb in relation to the crack cocaine epidemic, and that's just domestically. We could talk for even longer for international efforts in the Cold War, America's involvement in Indonesian genocide in the 1960s, the legacy of South American coups to stop the domino effect, the implementation of disaster capitalism. All of that's deeply important, but conservative conspiracists don't give a fuck about that, right? Because they are contrary to their politics, and also these conspiracy theories have ended. And you can't cycle through conspiratorial beliefs ad infinitum when the theory is conclusively ended and justice has mostly been had. They vaguely remember Watergate, already informed by some gut-level distrust of the government, and they invent stories of child sacrifice in order to feel marginalized again. Instead of confronting the inequalities of neoliberalism, they attack Jewish people. Repressive desublimation in action. They have money, they have houses, they have social power, and yet they LARP as victims in order to feel special, even though they are deeply privileged. And because they're partisanly racist, they refuse to empathize with actual oppressed people because they feel that it infringes upon their own power. They are too weak, yet too strong. They are too powerful, yet too degenerate to hold power. Dialectic liquidity, as powerful as coal and solar power, honest to God. The second is perhaps the most insane moment I saw in a movie last year. The entirety of Beau is Afraid is a pretty close contender. Near the end, Andrew is interviewing this QAnon influencer guy, and throughout the film there are these snippets of him calling this and that celebrity a pedophile, so Andrew pulls out of this file, that is, no joke, this court document, and Andrew with these brass balls, he's just like, this court document says that you are a child molester. Bro, have you ever heard of projection? Outrageous levels of confidence. That is an insane moment, but in a very abstract, kind of weird way. Next sentence is going to be kind of weird. But it felt validating because, in my conspiracism series, I hypothesized that conspiracism is often related to projection. It's not always, but sometimes. Where's the book? The It Takes One to Know One rule, as proposed by Rob Brotherton. Elaborate schemes are often easier to imagine if you yourself would be willing to scheme in order to get yourself in power and to keep the ones you dislike away from it. With both of these factors, privilege and projection, we can return to this album. When we look at Troglodyte, we learn about the main character, and he's a relatively privileged dude. decent job, enough free time to browse the internet and write about the things that he hates. It all relates back to how I was talking about aggrieved entitlement, and how the people the band are trying to write about aren't oppressed in any way that they couldn't actually organize to oppose. You know, work sucks, start a union. But instead, they take all of their anger out on their co-workers and their immediate bosses because that's easier and safer than attacking your workplace. Then back on Creepy Crawlers, we have this element of projection where we openly have the protagonist proclaiming that he believes in absurd conspiracy theories because if they were true, then everything would be fine. His anxiety would be justified and the world order would be reset. Oh, it's disgusting. I can't believe it. When I was younger, none of this existed. Everything was fine, everything was perfect, and now it's ruined. It's ruined because you voted in the wrong motherfucker. Systemic issues that don't affect me don't affect me, this character says. And he places the weight of society's ills upon the shoulders of the bad party. Even though when you take an honest assessment of contemporary politics, it was Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan's fault. Yes, I know the band is from Sweden. You're very clever. I really respect that about you. But Sebastian is American, and he takes overt influence from North American conspiracy theories in his own lyrics. This Place Rules is definitely more nuanced than internet comment etiquette, which is functionally going to happen when you compare a 20-minute comedic YouTube video with an 80-minute long comedic film. But despite all of its introspection and insanity, it still fails to persuade any theorists. Sure, the purpose of the piece was to highlight absurdity and not to reach across the aisle, but it's then no surprise that, with both of these styles of edgy internet satire, that the conspiracy theory commentary and general sense of humour of Cave World is so toothless. And I love internet comment etiquette, and I do admire how hard This Place Rule went. Their work is funny, it's fresh, it's edgy without being punching down, it's hip, it's current, it's urgent, but it's not nuanced. I love it, but it is inherently lowbrow. Funny because of how crass it is. And I don't mean to strip the fun out of your politics, but this is important. You know, look me in the eye when you look at this. Politics is not meant to be fun. We started making comedy about politics to get lay people interested in them. Late night talk shows, your Jon Stewarts and John Olivers of the world. But then the expectation of political commentary became dunking rather than analysis, gladiatorial sport rather than slow, patient discourse. And this is not their fault alone. We are incentivized by news companies and social media sites with their algorithms and advertisements to view politics as fun. Not because of the joy of helping people is inherently good, or the knowledge of progress means that we leave our children in a better world than what we started with, but because engagement equals profit. Politics is not meant to be fun. It should be passionate, it should be sincere, and slow, and careful, and satisfying, but not fun. Absolutely not. Aside from my philosophical disagreement with internet comment etiquette, a channel that I will gently remind you takes up a sixth of my entire sense of humour, I also disagree with the method. It is absurd that people believe in vaccine microchips, but simply calling it absurd and wrong falls terribly short of actually understanding why people believe in absurd things. There's another famous study in conspiracism science, in which the scientists take a bunch of relatively normal people with a healthy extra serving of the conspiratorially inclined, and they ask them an elongated series of contradictory questions, right? So they would ask things like, did Princess Diana fake her death? And then 23 some questions later, they would ask if Princess Diana was assassinated by the royal family. Then similarly diametric questions were asked about the Kennedy assassination, the killing of Osama bin Laden, and 9/11. So what the scientists found is when the conspiracy theorists answered these questions, the contradictions correlated with one another. Which is basically to say that the people who thought Princess Diana was assassinated was exponentially more likely to simultaneously believe that she faked her death. The scientists found that what they were actually measuring was not the belief in conspiracy, but the belief in deceit. In that the establishment isn't telling the truth of the situation, and that was the most important factor motivating the belief in conspiracy. The theorist has no doubt in their heart that the establishment is lying, so whatever theory is in front of them is mathematically more likely than the establishment telling the truth to them. It isn't one or the other, it is the impulse that authority are hiding the truth that unified disparate ideas. This is a contributing factor to why conspiracy theories are often contradictory. It isn't about logical deduction or coherent storytelling, but it's about reinforcing the impulse to distrust the establishment. It's also tied up in the big cause fallacy, this idea that we don't like when significant things are caused by insignificant events or individuals. You know, a car crash couldn't have killed the princess because a car crash is mundane and boring. My cousin Tarquin got 6 months probation for drunk driving his car through a flower store. There must be more to the story. There's a lot more that I could talk about here, but the point of this whole segment is that there actually are intelligent and thoughtful answers as to why conspiracy theorists believe what they do. And those answers are more interesting to explore than ignore. You can't just call something absurd. I feel like you have to try and explain why it's absurd, how it is divorced from the reality of politics and human relations, because calling something absurd is not actually going to persuade anyone you disagree with. It's a media of criticism that is utterly disinterested with making things better, but it is interested in keeping the in-group persuaded that they are right. And some people just will not listen to you because they're tied up in their own anti-Semitic schemas and their ideas of how the world actually works. But that leaves behind humanity. There is an important distinction to be made here, because we can focus so much time on debating bigots and not actually fighting for change, you know, in supporting immigrant rights and reproductive rights and civil rights. And if we all cared about those real prescient social issues, we wouldn't have to worry about convincing white bigots to be our allies. We wouldn't need to persuade them because the institutions of law would actually protect them from civil problems. This is important to remember, and it is something that I constantly struggle with my research and my writing. We need to do better, to have better arguments, because otherwise they will take us down with their sinking ship as well. So Viagra Boys wrote what I think is a philosophically confusing, apathetic little album, confounded as to what it is talking about, scored by admittedly dynamic sound palettes, and really good songwriting. But the ultimate message is that humanity is fucked, and we should just laugh as the world burns. And I don't think that's the answer as to how we should do good postmodern satire, nor is it what I would consider to be persuasive or essential punk rhetoric. To be real with you guys, it's a solid 8 out of 10 album that goes to about a 7 in my mind. Yeah, I made this video that long over 1 point decrease. How fucking good's that? While their use of ironic misogyny is compelling in the ways that it is employed to criticize toxic masculinity and illuminate the ways in which men can be better than their fathers, it falls short in providing anything close to an answer, because that's their only trick, and the trick wasn't equipped for the literary ambitions of the record. And I tend to think that you're all well and good to make a stink about how something is morally problematic and all, but if you can't provide, like, a compelling answer to the questions that you're tackling, then your criticism isn't particularly useful. So, how do we do punk rhetoric, postmodern satire, and masculinity in such a way to make the world better? I think I have part of the answer to that very specific question. I'm done! What's fun? Brutalism is synonymous with concrete structures, exposed pillars, and rough edges. Brutalism is not shy about how it was made. It doesn't hide the bolts, it would never disguise the purpose of the form. It is bluntly form over function. Brutalist sculptures are both ugly and strangely elegant, simple and to the point, but with a little bit of creative architectural flair, a proclamation of the majesty of modernity. So what does it mean when a bunch of noisy post-punks from Bristol in the UK name their debut album Brutalism? Well, they're proclaiming that the record is going to be pretty straightforward meat and potatoes punk rock, but it will be filling, driving, and really, really fucking loud. I'm done! What's fun? I'm done! Yes, it is a brand new day. Yes, you are very clever. Yes, it is winter now. This isn't to say that there is no irony associated with idols at all. Take, for example, their music video for Well Done, arguably their breakout hit. The lead singer appears to have pissed in his white jeans, the punk drummer looks like a dweeb, the guitarist is only wearing his undies, everyone but him are all wearing white collar shirts, yet they are all demented and rowdy on stage. Also, the lyrics are overtly political.
You know, they aren't idly standing by. There is this condescending, sarcastic aura to the vocals. Why don't you get a job? Even Tarquin has a job. Why don't you win a medal? Even Tarquin has a degree. So why don't you watch football? Lead singer Joe Talbot proclaims in frustration that he would rather bite off his nose to spite his face. He seems to be railing against these mundane but socially acceptable things. You should get a degree because it gets you a good job, rather than having a degree because the contents of it interest you and, knowledge being enriching in itself. All men watch football. Why don't you? What's wrong with you? Even bloody Tarquin has a job and he's a dumbass. With these specific political references, getting on a bike to find a job, letting them eat cake, Joe frames these calls as classist as well. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and maybe you could also be like that good old boy Tarquin. That's not a common name in Australia, but it has upper-class connotations in England. Joe appears to have gone a bit mad, waving his arms out of tune, as if there's a different song in his head altogether. His voice has a lo-fi quality to it, while the instrumental is a bit rough around the edges, and the vocals peak a little as he screams in defiance. What makes this song work is its passionate playing and performances. As someone who has seen them live, this song absolutely murders in the pit. But because anyone deep enough into music to know Viagra Boys, they're probably well versed in the genre, and there's no pretending that idols are just a bunch of meatheads. They share enough qualities that they actually do have a similar crossover appeal. If you like one, you'll likely jive with the other. In fact, I would be willing to bet that you might have some opinions about idols. We'll get to them in the next episode. Viagra Boys are admittedly more dynamic than idols. When you listen to a record of theirs, you don't really know what's coming up next. Will it be a country song? A straightforward punk tune about prawns? What about a dash of synth punk? And the vocals are very good at portraying these seedy, loose characters. Sure, Seb can pull off a love song, and he can sing a little bit. The duet with Amy Taylor at the end of Welfare Jazz is kind of sweet. But he's excellent at this one thing, and he usually sticks to it, which is fine, because he's really funny and entertaining as a singer. But from idols, you are more likely to get just a noisy punk rager. But what they do have are a bunch of excellent musicians, a knack for songwriting that is both catchy and hard as nails. And they have quite a lot of heart, which is a touch surprising because you take one look at the band and they look like a bunch of scary bikies. But what I love about them is that they are sincerely a bunch of teddy bears who just want to sing about love and tolerance. This alone, the offensive contrast between the rough as guts production and the often wholesome lyrics, is so interesting. This dynamic is fleshed out more on their later records, but Brutalism is the best place to start for a Viagra Boys fan because it's full of snark, sarcasm, and abrasive soundscapes. The track Stendhal Syndrome introduces this interesting contrast between lyrics and title. The lyrics on Brutalism deal a bit more in absurdity, and are thus a bit denser to unpack than their later albums. But the syndrome of the song's title refers to a rare clinical condition where a patient has violent panic attacks after they look at a beautiful piece of art. Dizziness, sweating, and passing the fuck out are symptoms. Relatable. And the lyrics are not about this at all, really. Rather, they deal with the violent and blunt rejection of beautiful art, more often than not abstract art. You already know the type. This looks like this was drawn by my 2-year-old kid. Type of bullshit. Abstract art seemingly makes these people go into a frenzy, hence the title. In retort to this anti-intellectual rhetoric, Joe replies that ignorance is not bliss and he's not pleased, meaning that the art whinger is ignorant and their vapid anger makes them miserable. Joe is frustrated at how their opinion has spread like a disease on the cultural right. It's seemingly a partisan issue, all of his hating signed urinals and all. When we consider the overt anti-fascist leanings and lyrics throughout their discography, you could argue that the message on this song about the virulent hatred of abstract art displayed on the right wing is a bit of a fascist impulse. If you think that's a stretch, I would recommend this video to you, because it explains it super well. With Joe lamenting the lack of appreciation and lack of creativity latent in these art whingers. The only thing they're good at making themselves is hot air, and he ultimately retorts,
"Before photos were as you wanted them to be, there would be page 3 as far as the eye could see. Hot air!"
The band are affirming the value of unconventional art. Because we rely upon artists for mundane things. Graphic design takes artistry even when it's for a public relations press release. Music is needed to score advertisements, and these right-wingers see photography and painting as totally utilitarian in function. It must add cultural value to society for it to be good art. A beautiful sculpture is morally good. A urinal is degenerate because it doesn't add anything, even though the unbridled provocation. It created amazing discourse, and that is the very point of the thing. It also critiques the male gaze, the third page of certain British tabloids generally being dedicated to bikini babes in their bosoms and lack of bodices. The gaze-induced marketing inherent in the lowest common denominator convention will be talked about again in a few minutes. But aesthetics is not just about beauty, but about reactions, observations, representations. The art is about how it affects you, and Idol's music, which certainly is art despite what some punk-hating dickheads might say, is rich with cynicism and a political point. The rejection of art is to distill culture into good and bad, where art is about existence itself, and thus it can comment on and reflect anything. The track White Privilege has another example of a song where the themes are tied together by the title. What do all of these verses about abortions, butlers, student loans, and sports all have in common? Well, they all tie together under white privilege. To not get arrested for doing shitloads of drugs with your student loan money. To be born into a family wealthy enough to afford a butler who can change light bulbs for you. Alongside being able to be an optimist when shit keeps getting worse for everyone else around you. Joe even attacks himself on the song by stating, where, like, yes, being in a band means that you have some kind of privilege. In the early days of your career, you have to be able to afford an instrument. You're lucky if you can also afford lessons. And if you're good enough, you need the free time and the savings to go on tour or even record an EP. The beating heart of this album is this unfocused rage. And all of this was channeled from Joe's mother's recent passing. She worked as a revenue worker, and when she had a stroke, Joe shouldered his mother's palliative care. She died during the recording of Brutalism. Joe's absolute rage and grief is present in every song, but it's never more present than the aptly titled Mother. With the hard-as-nails bass line and the tightly performed drums, Joe's rage is potent and infectious. We approach a new motif in Idles' music, where each verse is an island, not narratively connected to the next one exactly, but the point in interpretation is attained by comparing the verses to one another. You find out what they have in common thematically. So on verse 1, Joe rants, "My mother worked 15 hours, 5 days a week. My mother worked 16 hours, 6 days a week." We initially get this game of one-upsmanship. Your mother worked 5 days? Well, mine worked 6. It's juvenile, it's schoolyard play fighting, but it also reflects the realities of workers finding pride in their own exhaustion. My mum is better than both of y'all's because she works 17 hours, 7 days a week, darling. That's a conservative value. You know, hard work only ever pays off for the boss. We then contrast this proclamation of value with the next verse. The best way to scare a Tory is to read and get rich. Tories, British conservatives, are in favour of class subjugation and helping their rich friends screw over the poorest and most vulnerable in society. So there's a couple of connections here. First, this reflects how Tories appropriate class language to gain votes and support. My mother worked hard, and my family never wanted anything. So work hard, and you can be just like us. Never mind the trust fund that my offshore investments with my father's company by which my mother is also employed. When it has explicitly and historically been the Conservative Party that has advocated for longer hours for less pay for everyone else. This is what capitalists do, after all. Not to mention the language here is certainly gendered, my mother this and my mother that. No matter that women and mothers alike must work double duty, in which they work their blue-collar jobs, which they are paid less by their male colleagues, and then they go home and pull a second shift for no pay. Idols are aware of this disparity, and Joe says that the song is a reflection on the lives of the women around him. The first verse goes from this brag to a commentary on austerity, British budget cuts that deeply inform the reality of nurses and civil servants having to do more for less. To read and get rich is a metaphor, not only for gaining loads of money, but for gaining a richer understanding of politics, literature, the things that books can actually provide. The problem with reading is that you actually have to have time to read.
This has been in the discourse lately. There's some things I have to say about it. We'll talk about it another time. But you have to have access to books via a library, or you're spending a non-allocated rent and food money on a book and sitting down for like 13 hours or more to read and digest the damn thing. Audiobooks help me, but they cost money as well. So when you work for more hours for less pay, you are given less leisure time to think about societal problems because you're just trying to make ends meet. My own personal conspiracy theory, we all get one, is that we have such an attention economy for superhero shows, 7-hour video game plot descriptions, and true crime podcasts, and these are functionally used to like stop you from thinking about stuff during the day because you're focused on a mindless hobby instead. No time to be angry at your boss when you could be angry at Harley Quinn's lack of bahonga donga tits instead. The public represses and sublimates themselves. Stopping people from thinking is, of course, literalized on the pre-chorus. People watch a show like Breaking Bad to indulge in a power fantasy. A pathetic man with cancer uses ingenuity to become a meth kingpin. Oh boy, what can I do? And even though there is this obvious, legit, impossible levels to miss obvious critique of masculinity and its relation to pride that is built into the very DNA of the show, fans will still get angry at the female characters for infringing upon the power fantasy, because they came for the fantasy and they do not want to have to think about what the fantasy entails. Like, that's fine, whatever, but media literacy generally is important so you can analyze movies, but also news media and advertisements, to think about how a story is framed and all. While the tone of the lyric is cynical in nature, there is this sadness to it as well, in which you don't think about your expectation of working 17 hours 7 days a week, an exaggerated figure to someone like me, but is essential to a single-parent household trying to look after, school, feed, and house multiple kids. Kids you must shoulder because Tories hate sex education, defunded abortion clinics, and also childcare centres. So you're exhausted and you watch a TV show to escape how miserable you are. And Tories further misdirect those frustrations by encouraging hatred towards immigrants, feminists, anyone but themselves. When we discourage media literacy and we encourage playground grandstanding, we view women as subservient handmaidens. My teacher got pregnant instead of teaching me bloody English. My mother is supposed to work 17 hours 7 days a week to buy my shit, and then she has to do free labor in the home afterwards because I'm her son and she's my mother. That's what they do for us. Neoliberalism devalues mothers, austerity devalues women, and Tories are literally a bunch of motherfuckers for instilling these biases into kids. So much is said in just a few short verses. Brutalism is a whip-smart punk record with a strong personality and killer songwriting. Most of the time. I reckon the first half of the album is pretty fantastic, but the second half, although the lyrics are always killer, lags in the visceral entertainment department in my own opinion. Still, it's an album that has a lot to say for itself, and it would be any other band's best album, just on the strength of tracks like Mother, Well Done, Heal Heal, and 2049 Goffo alone. But this is Idols, and they have 2 albums better than Brutalism. Everything's derivative. You absorb what you love and you celebrate it. Derivative is not a dirty word, it just is to certain people. In 2018, the band came back with a vengeance, with Joy as an act of resistance. Joy is, honestly, it's in my top 5 favorite albums of all time. It is, quite frankly, remarkable it's taken me this long to talk about it. The record is, once again, hardly the most inventive thing under the sun. Some have derided it as merely nostalgic, and some hold its unoriginality as a mark against it. But to me, it feels like the best parts of the genre collapsing into one glorious package. Idols refines their songwriting and production to godlike levels of finesse. It's the kind of record where 6 songs are tied for my personal favorite. So, while I could go on for hours and hours dissecting the details of each track, and I really do think I would quite enjoy doing that, I am going to try and keep this video focused on topic. Tie it back to my thesis. Technically speaking, Joy is much better produced than its predecessor. It lacks the rough edges of Brutalism, which definitely has its own appeal as a noise rock enjoyer. But Joy is simultaneously nasty and gorgeously produced. The searing heat of the guitar tones, the sour aftertaste they leave you with, the driving, girthy bass lines, and the percussion. It sounds so good, just like perfectly balanced, like volume, timbre, and crunchiness.
delectable. It is the perfect balance of rowdy and professional sounding, tightly performed but truly wild feeling. It feels alive and in the moment, while still retaining a groomed studio beauty. To me, it is a perfect pop album. But, normal boys, it sounds like an abrasive, noisy, scary record. Idols, like Viagra boys before them, are an acquired taste, but they are perfect to my very specific inclinations. I suppose now is a good time to compare the bands a little more thoroughly. And, I don't want this to come across as, this is the good band and this is the bad band. I hope it's clear that, I practice the be critical of the things you like school of media criticism. While I do prefer Idols, Viagra Boys are a more dynamic sounding band. But conceptually, I find Joe to be more compelling lyricist-wise. But Sebastian is better at singing in character. Additions and subtractions flow back and forth. One thing I noticed in preparing this video is that the substance of their satire is a little bit different. Let's return to Ain't Nice for a moment. We have our slimy, misogynistic protagonist. You ain't that nice, but you got a nice face. Hope I can keep all my shit at your place. You aren't nice to me, but you look hot, so I'm going to exploit you for a place to put my calculators. But if you don't accept me for me, then I'm out of here. And that's your loss, mamacita. His blustering sense of sexiness and self-worth leads him to act a cock. But at the end of the day, he can't offer anything to a relationship. And the song is certainly about sexism and entitlement. It's a little bit about paranoia and laziness. But there isn't really any grander critique than... Ooh, that guy sucks. And as we've discussed, this is due in part to there being a wider narrative on that record, a definite beginning to contrast your endpoint. And how effective that narrative is at dissecting misogyny is up for debate. But one thing I like about Idols is that they also talk about these vapid entitled men. But while they aren't quite as brash or funny, in my opinion, they come through with a more thoughtful critique. I want to discuss this with a string of the less discussed songs on the record, because I want to point out the nuances that exist within the margins. On the obviously titled Love Song, Talbot ridicules the same kinds of vapidness, but with a more socially aware edge, never made more apparent than when our protagonist exclaims his love for someone and justifies it by saying,
Look at the card I bought. It says I love you.
Not only is there a critique of the vapidness of modern love, but of his intrinsic relationship to consumerism. We need holidays like Valentine's Day to come along once a year to prove your love by spending a shit ton of money on someone, rather than, having to treat your partner special every day and having to actually be nice to them regularly. Valentine's Day has always come across to me as the one day a year in which card companies want the population to breed to maintain the race. I wonder why I can't get a date. And in the first verse of the song, we have this line about writing a love song because you love the person so much. And they show that love by carrying a watermelon. The character is portrayed with some warmth here. He's not wholly a cynic who just wants to carry a piece of fruit just to smash. But he is emotionally stunted, unable to express the depths of his passion and love because of his masculinity making him feel soft. So he offers to carry a watermelon, and that in itself is vulnerability. Unable to properly offer himself and to enrich the relationship with someone he cares for, he defers to charity rather than sincere earnestness. And I know the line is originally from a movie, but the standards of romance with a capital R, they've just become so diluted just in this person that carrying a watermelon is this grand gesture of affection to some. And love is often made up of these small, thoughtful gestures. You fill up a water bottle for your partner while they sleep so they can wake up and they can refresh themselves if they like. Bringing them home something they like after they tell you they've had a bad day. Just being there to listen about that bad day. Love is gestures and signals that we do care. To love is to worry. It's to give a fuck. To learn that you are two people separate, and you will grow old and you will become two entirely different people together. And to welcome that for as terrifying and as beautiful as that actually is. And then to have that all reduced to, I carried a watermelon, I want to be vulnerable, is hysterical, because it expects all of that. Because he carried a large piece of fruit. Partaking in the most boring labor just to smash. It's so depressing what people attracted to men have to settle for. I do like him, but as one, we really should step up our game. It's video essayists and it's gym bros.
And my body doesn't look very good, and I also have a pretty shitty personality. I'm not going to keep all of that. The song is obviously more complicated than all of that as well. The second verse being an ode to suppressing your id. Not drinking, not fucking, not taking drugs. The normative value of love a best friend can only be attained by abstination, something you don't really want to do, and it just ends in resentment, which is antithetical to the normative value in the first place. The fourth verse being afraid of changing and trying to keep your partner the exact same lest you fall out of love with them, which is the point of falling in love with someone in the first place. It's all brilliant. I pulled so much more out of Love Song, and I talked about so many different subjects and nuances of love than Viagra Boys ever really made me do. I'm not saying that those nuances don't exist at all, but they aren't at the forefront of what they're trying to achieve creatively. And I want to stress that that's fine, but it's just that I prefer how idols do it. After Love Song, which I obviously think is this fiery takedown of romance under neoliberalism, we have June, which is this slow, lumbering piece that is the most somber and meditative song in the entire Idols catalogue. The title refers to a pregnancy that was stillborn by Joe and his then wife. It is a tearjerker, and while it's not a banger that goes off in the club exactly, it sets up this concept of grief and its relation to masculinity that is then partially investigated on the next song, Samaritans. On Brutalism, we saw Joe process the death of his mother with this wild, chaotic rage. And during the in-between time of both albums, he went through a lot of therapy, in which he aimed to try and deal with his anger in healthier, less toxic ways. Joy is noticeably less furious. It is measured but nonetheless righteous in its anger. And we will cover how this manifests in a little bit, but the song allows this man to vent his grief into a song to make people like him feel less alone. Also, it might be a bit cold on my part, but what's always stuck out to me about the phrase "baby shoes for sale, never worn," while often wrongfully attributed to Ernest Hemingway, it kind of adds to the themes of austerity on the record. In my own brain, I'm thinking, God, are you really so broke? Can you really not make the rent that you have to sell the baby shoes? That's the second most depressing thing about the song. But while the song isn't exactly a catchy banger, the structure is actually really interesting. I would go as far as to describe it as a bit post-rock inspired, adjacent at least, where the composition of the music serves to evoke an emotional response rather than an explicit experiential head-thrashing one. You might call it art punk, but I call that semantics, because if it quacks like a duck, and it waddles like a duck, and it bites my fucking finger like a duck, then I ain't gonna call it a mongoose. The guitars are so despondent, they make you feel viscerally depressed and stuck in a rut. Down-tempo and sporadic, they linger at the bottom of the mix, not being too loud as to distract from the powerful performance of the vocals. And the percussion is electronic, vaguely evoking an electrocardiogram, the machine that goes beep when the heart stops. Joe says in an interview that hearing his firstborn daughter's heart flatline on the way to hospital was amongst the scariest moments of his life. And this is replicated in the middle of the song as it features no percussion with these loud explosions of guitars. Alongside this casual whistling, I've always kind of interpreted that as the janitor going about his business in the next room, completely unaware about how your pregnancy has been has been devastated, along with how the universe is cold and suffering doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And the rest of the song builds to this post-rock crescendo that dissolves into nothingness after the percussion gives out. The structure of the song is beautiful conceptually, and the performances are appropriately morose and somber. It's such a shocking and tastefully executed moment. For a punk band! This post-rock angle is experimented a little bit more with on the next track, Samaritans. Its monotonous progression, its unassuming chorus, it isn't a song to write home about exactly, it's fine, but when you consider the song as being a bit more of an art piece and a catchy tune, I think you get more interesting results. The song reads as this list of things that boys hear from their male elders. And I went to an all-boys school, and I probably heard all of these at least once a week for 4 years there. Not from my dad, though. Shout out to him for letting him be a weird media guy in your phone. I'm
I'm about 80% sure he's proud of me. These phrases are repeated so much that they become mundane, just like the chord progression. And this is obviously an intentional choice that perpetuates itself throughout the song. The cries of man up, sit down, chin up, pipe down, chafe against your patience. We return to the grief that was introduced on June, where Joe felt a conflict in his sorrow, this need to put up a front and be a man for his grieving wife, but his essential need to grieve his child for himself. You know, this toughness clashes against his vulnerable grief. And this manifested in rage, a furious rage. Brutalism has a much nastier character to the record than anything else that Idols have ever done. Its detractors are cut down with harsher language, it has brutal peaking intonation, and there is less inclination towards empathy. And while it is very entertaining for its bluntness, it isn't something you really want to wallow in, because it's ultimately a touch immature. And what Joe learned from his therapy is that toxic masculinity, the practice of telling boys to grow some balls when they feel sad, stifles their ability to have healthy reactions to sorrow, grief, and their feelings in general. This process has been described by bell hooks as the normal traumatization of boys, where the masculine expectations of fathers, uncles, and other normal boys cause them to shame the slightest of feminine actions in boys in order to toughen them up. As Joe sings on the chorus, the mask of masculinity is a mask that's wearing me. Masculinity is a front of which men have to play act and pantomime, and this acting wears down their stamina, and this causes them to lash out at their loved ones. The mask overwhelms you as you put up a front for yourself to be regarded well by other men. A front that is explored more when Joe points out that toxic masculinity is the reason why you never see your father cry, and why some people never see their fathers at all. Both fathers abandoning those they get pregnant, and also fathers working themselves to the bone to provide for their family. I'm lucky enough that I did see my dad cry around me when I was little, and I now appreciate how impactful those experiences were on me, because I say this without wanting to, sound like I have too much pretense in my body, but they deeply impacted the person I ended up being. But with all of that said, I am a person who struggles to cry. I can listen to something haunting, like a sinner get ready, or I can listen to something beautiful like the end monologue of Silent Hill 2, and I can get a little bit teary from the beauty of it all, like just a little bit. But I'm not a crier. I would like to be, but it's just not something that comes to me naturally. I've heard that it has something to do with the autism. Masculinity to me is a performance, a cluster of recognized behaviors including toughness, a diametric cocktail of stoicism and defensive anger, and a cultural aversion to vulnerability and affection. Toxicity and masculinity is when these traits impact our relations with others, when we feel resentment over our lack of touch, and when we feel the need to tear down our friends because that's what they do to us, and when we attempt to control gendered behaviors of others. Further, consider crying. To cry as a man is weirdly taboo for reasons that I understand academically, but emotionally it confuses me. Crying amongst men seems to be taboo because it's a symbol of caring too much, of lacking composure and being womanly or childish. So outside of weddings and funeral, this behavior is not tolerated between them. This constant pantomime of ideal masculinity and the failure to live up to it causes violence and resentment to fester, emotions that could probably be relieved by having a decent cry. The point of this song is that it tries to reach out to men in the depths of toxic masculinity, and the instrumental reflects that mundane, affectionless, cold reality that many of them exist within. It makes them angry, and they let loose that anger on other men as an act of dominance. I saw Idols in Melbourne in Halloween 2022. I took one of my most cherished friends and frequent script collaborator Sochi along. Naturally, we dressed up as Jennifer and Needy for Jennifer's body. I wore a frilly pink dress, and when we were on tram en route, this miserable old codger growled at us for my having shoes on an empty seat across from us. He followed this by calling us a bunch of puffs. I just remember thinking, dude, it's Halloween. We weren't the only people on this tram in costume. And, I'm comfortable enough in my own masculinity that, I can wear a dress and have a fun time. Bro, I looked cute as hell. But this old man saw me, and he felt insecure in his own masculinity. And he expressed it as this vindictive anger, this moral outrage, because I was out of line. I was not representing classic masculinity, and I had to be reprimanded for this. Can you even imagine feeling emasculated by me?
He's not the only person to fall victim to my charms. But believe it or not, I won a couple of fights in high school. I actually low-key have a brown belt in karate. I haven't touched martial arts in a decade, though, so I'm sure that dude probably would have kicked my ass. But masculinity to me is like being open about the things that you do like and owning them. In being your own man, you define yourself and you stand for what you believe in, no matter what anyone else really thinks of you. That's me, but that's not how most men think, because male friendships can be very difficult to maintain because there's no affection outside of humor. To be appreciative of another person's company labels you this pussy faggot poof. An actual phrase someone called me in high school because I wore deodorant. When I heard this song the first time, it reflected many of those frustrations I had felt. The band are angry, and they lament what is being lost, and that anger motivates them to write about a better future for men and for everyone else around them. Their anger is motivating rather than destructive. Hopeful, not nihilistic. To quote Joe and lead guitarist, producer, and all-around Irish legend Mark Bowen, "If you think anger is a part of this band, then you're missing the point. Anger is a secondary emotion. It comes from fear, hunger, fatigue, grief, loss, lots of things. Someone who makes a lot of noise and is aggressive is often being defensive. They are defensive because they are protecting themselves. It's completely fair that a lot of people, myself included, have a lot to be angry about right now. But it's about coming at that anger with a sense of patience, empathy, and grace in order to make a difference."
Hey, we built this album and we built this tour on love and compassion. Whatever you do tonight, if you're in this crowd, you look after each other. You respect each other. Show each other love. Show each other how much you love live music. Not aggression, but love and compassion. Come on!
We feminist types, we talk a lot about how masculinity is in crisis, but we don't have answers or really any prescriptions for men. We say, "You're toxic, sort your shit out." Part of me is somewhat frustrated by this, because if we denounce everyone as a lost cause, then we abstain from actually having to try to help other people. But I do earnestly think that it is ultimately up to men to put in the work to become better. And what I find so wonderful about idols is that they are putting in that work, and they are trying to come up with something more constructive instead of just tearing down men. There is this profound performance of the band playing at Glastonbury 2019, and when Joe hears his lyrics of love and tolerance being shouted enthusiastically back at him, he starts crying. He doesn't try to hide it, he doesn't walk off stage. He lives in the moment, and he weeps openly because of how wonderful it is that something he and his deepest compatriots made with passion and love has resonated with so many strangers. His then wife and newborn come out to comfort him. Rhetoric is not just about words, but about posture, emotion, the sense of authenticity. What Joe is doing here is political in a sense. He's a very masculine man, being vulnerable by openly crying, the social taboo. But he isn't doing it because it's political or shocking. He's just being himself. It's such a beautiful moment. From a punk band! Punk can be overly masculine and aggressive, but it is those types of punks that need to hear what idols are trying to say the most. On the first listen, I was further deeply moved at the end of Samaritans, among the final lines of the song where Joe proudly proclaims that I kissed a boy and I liked it, accompanied by this powerful post-rock crescendo making the moment feel so monumental. It takes this bisexual kind of fetishistic line from a pop song and it appropriates it as liberating. At that time in my life, I hadn't really heard a classically masculine man like Joe, weird, bikey, pint-drinking looking, weird-looking Welsh guy, say something like that. I only learned in researching this video that he's openly bisexual, like me. It meant a lot to me when I was younger. I'm going to limit myself to one more track because I really need to keep the show on the road. Please do appreciate how much self-restraint I am showing by not talking about all the songs that everyone's already heard before. Like, you don't need me to repeat the tales of Roy the Walking Thyroid or the Snowflake Avalanche. Okay, fine, quick fire round. Colossus is a perfect tension-building opener with themes of self-harm, self-doubt, and several wrestling references. What's not to love? Never Fight a Man with a Perm is a hilarious takedown of gym bros, high on their own supply and so roided out that they're constantly looking for a fight, all the while ending on this pacifist note, urging men to make up instead of beating each other senseless. I'm Scum is another funny track that's self-deprecating as it is an affirmation of the strength of leftist unity, while also being a takedown of liberal values. James Bond being black won't stop him from being an imperialist agent, governor. Television is about the relationship between beauty standards, media, and commerce. Also, the opening line literally changed my life and helped me to break my own cycle of self-criticism and self-hatred. Suicidal thoughts arrive unbidden. I repeat Joe's words, and then I move on. Great is an anti-Brexit call to unify and love one another. Gramrock is such a funny little character portrait, it still makes me giggle with a chance of bada bada bing, I'm the king! It's a takedown of yuppie brutes, and a return to the esoteric relational storytelling of brutalism with wicked satire. Rottweiler is an anti-fascist song about how absurd you must sound to liberals, how paranoid the right needs to make you look for them to appear reasonable. There's a snake in my boot, there's milk in my coffee. Does milk equal white supremacy here? Yes! Yes, it does. Sorry, if you drink milk, you're a white supremacist for all time. That goes for all you cheese lovers as well. And don't even get me started on Fanta, because Fanta was invented by the Nazis, and that's why I only drink cranberry juice and Sunkist. But I do have to talk about the most affirming and delightful track on the album, Danny Nedelko. The song's title refers to Joe's best friend. Bro is a Ukrainian immigrant who fronts a punk band of his own, Heavy Lungs, who, fun fact, once interviewed Sebastian from Viagra Boys. It's a neat little conversation. Sebastian seems high off of his fucking tits.
I'm drinking a white wine called Cotes de Salmon. I don't know. But I've become a wine connoisseur the past couple weeks.
But it's really interesting. And there's quite a lot to break down despite the simple premise and the structure of the song. This track is an ode to the value of immigrants in British society. When we talk about immigration politically, there's a lot of talk about why it in itself is bad. And often the retorts frame their responses as, you are wrong because your arguments are wrong. Immigration actually helps the economy. Immigration keeps the population levels up. But we rarely talk about the value of immigrants existing in the first place. You know, the cross-pollination of cultures makes society more interesting. It makes for better art, better food, better friends, and more well-versed and intelligent society as a whole. Joe contrasts Danny with Freddie Mercury, who was born in Zanzibar, went to school in India, and fled to Britain with his family at 17. And you know what, say what you will about, the privilege of all of that. There aren't many people more British than Queen, and the most iconic member of Queen was an immigrant. But intelligently, Joe then contrasts this with a Nigerian mother of three, pointing out that immigrants don't have to be special to be worthy of praise, along with the fact that some people will lionize the former and chastise the latter for not being British enough, when in reality both raised their families in the UK and both are as British as the next. This motif is repeated on a later verse. Sandwiched between activist Malala with athlete Mo Farah is the image of an everyday Polish butcher. The curious thing about this specific framing, which did attract some criticism by leftist commentators, was that it seemingly only values immigrants when they are hard workers or when they are famous. Never mind the line about the Nigerian mother of three, although I suppose being a mother is unpaid labour. But for the sake of argument, let's look at a think piece by the blog No Wave UK. Talbot's lyrics are basically a kitchen sink reimagining of the noble savage. In Idol's lyrics, immigrants' presence in the UK is justified by their hard work and the strength of their characters, not the most basic of things, their humanity. So, are we unconditionally welcoming immigrants because we love them, or is it a meritocracy? Of course we welcome the brave and beautiful ones, but ugly cowards apparently don't deserve a mention. We'll come back to this article in the next video because you'll see. But to me, with the context of the entire discography and not just this one song, this seems to be a self-aware move from the band. This is a rhetorical strategy. Idols are using this song to reach across the partisan aisle, to point out to people who have only heard the worst about immigrants that there is genuine value to the family down the road who run their local kebab shop. The band are not saying that immigrants are only good if they have jobs. They are appealing to the conservative value of having a job to affirm immigrants in the first place, and by implication diversity as a whole. And all of that being that this is a healthy part of society. Framed and affirmed by the previous verse in which Joe sings, "My best friend is an alien. I know him, and he is. My best friend is a citizen. He's strong, he's earnest, he's innocent." Once again, you could criticize the band for saying that immigration is only good when you are personally sure that the individual immigrant is good and hardworking. Maybe they're alright school of politics. But this is not the praxis of Idols. They are confronting a mainstream conservative opinion of immigrants being welfare bludgers, arriving in a new country for inscrutable reasons detached from the realities of war started by Western nations squabbling over oil resources. And there is this envy and disgust towards them. They project and they defame. "I work 15 hours 5 days a week. You sit at home and you make the same money as I do." A fact that's just completely and utterly not true in the first place. Instead of confronting their bosses for their shitty pay, a system-wide problem with a requirement to change everything systematically, they say immigrants are the problem so that no one has to do anything about it. Cutting their pensions are only going to hurt the working poor and leave the wealthy just as they were before. Writing a song with that subtext is valuable, but instead of attacking the rich, they affirm the value of immigrants existing alongside us in the first place. When the conversation is at the stage of, all immigrants are lazy and they are degrading society, while it might be more work for you to jump straight to, immigrants are great even when they're on welfare and they're doing drugs, actually, and they don't have to have jobs to be valuable, and we should abolish state borders to allow total freedom of movement for all immigrants. True as the reality of that actually is, and as much as I wholeheartedly and unironically agree with the latter statement, if you would like to win an argument and shift the Overton's window to the left, you must engage with the current debate. You can go whole hog and reveal your power level, but you must be careful to consider whether or not it will be disregarded altogether and outright. Rhetoric is as much about posture and prudence as it is exclamation and the building of rapport. This is an ideology that thinks entirely in short, unnuanced, black and white beliefs. The right will take literally any excuse they can to put you into a box and dismiss you as a pervert, lest you start to make sense. And before you retort, "So, that's heaps hypocritical, hey. You said Viagra boys were bad because they use conservative premises, and here you are doing the same thing, but this time it's based in work just because Joe is a dilf, nitpicking and biased." Well, I would say first, media comprehension check. Those two things are not the same rhetorically. One comes from a joking apathy and the other comes from a tactical concern for material conditions. But secondly, we do not live in a socialist utopia, and we will not see one in our lifetimes. We are in a capitalist democracy, and like it or not, conservatives have as much freedom of speech as we do. Yes, liberals and centrists can fall victim to fascists with their invocation of free speech, but they are more likely to listen to us because we actually have something practical and good to offer them. You absolutely do not have to validate those racist premises because they are unequivocally wrong, but you do have to set up those premises before you can create more radical arguments. This, in my opinion, is a more pragmatic way to start to enact change. When the conversation is that all immigrants are animals, the way you convince someone to come over to your side is that you actually start to affirm the humanness of immigrants as a foundation. So like with Viagra boys, Idols are in a way using a right-wing rhetorical strategy to sway minds and persuade, but Idols are doing so by engaging in language that actual people off the streets can be persuaded by, and not just your terminally online communist friends. It's all well and good to advocate for open borders and be an anarchist about it, but you have to build a public up to that. Otherwise, you will alienate the average person. And I don't exactly have a lot of sympathy for liberals, but they are the populace we need to be trying to talk to the most. Some allies are better than no allies at all. So all you're really doing by advocating for the abolition of states altogether, immediately and in this specific context, is virtue signaling to distinguish yourself from the normie liberals. You say, I am smarter and more woke than all of you. So it doesn't really matter if you don't listen to me, actually. It is selfish and masturbatory politics. And I'm not saying that these positions are wrong either, because I feel sympathetic towards them, but you have to actually back up ideology with praxis and arguments. Idols are putting in that work, and by design it is blunt and not covering every single politically correct virtue possible. The song is less than 300 words, and most of those words are yeah or spelling. That it would be impossible. But to criticize them for trying to engage with centrists, liberals, and conservatives is to criticize someone for actually trying to do something while you look on doing nothing. That is contemptible, and we will return to this subject in the next episode as well. There is an element to the music video that I find immensely curious. We have Danny running around the city, hugging, high-fiving, and laughing with people of various ethnicities, and he encourages them to do this hand sign. This hand symbol was once upon a time akin to okay. You imagine a chef tasting her soup and making the symbol when she determines the soup has no more salt. Perfecto! Or back in my day, it was kind of the schoolyard prank. You try to go as long as possible without someone doing this to you. But this hand symbol was appropriated by online neo-Nazis, the alt-right, which I don't really know if they're a thing anymore, but we're gonna act as if they still are, because that's what the music video did. And the hand symbol was employed as a dog whistle. The free finger standing up stands for W, meaning white, and the index and thumb touching stands for P, meaning people. The symbol was made particularly infamous a year after this music video came out with a Christchurch shooter posing with it in an infamous photo. So, why the hell are a band as politically correct and socially conscious as Idol's doing it? Well, what I think they were trying to do here before the shooting, do recall, is they were trying to reclaim the symbol for the left. I do remember a lot of discourse about this, are the band heels or are they now trying to heal the rift? And I do have some reservations about it. Like, obviously the band didn't see the mass shooting in New Zealand coming and they might have refrained from doing so if they had known. I admit that I'm not in love with the concept. There is this stigma now, and there's too much context to ignore. But what the music video does is show a bunch of people laughing, smiling, and joyfully interacting with Joe's best friend. He wears a shirt that says "No one is an island." It affirms the messages against toxic masculinity, that men should take other men's feelings seriously and be brave enough to ask if they're going alright. But it can also refer to Britain itself, England, Wales, Scotland. They do make up an island, but it's also a cultural melting pot. I wouldn't dare to call the whole island British lest the Scottish Republicans come for me. I'm Angus. I was conceived in Scotland. Fuck the king, love your work. British does not solely equate whiteness, notwithstanding the vast and unignorable legacy of British colonialism, of which the band openly critique and lampoon. But due to their colonialism, England is a pretty diverse country. All of the people of Britain make up their country, not just the white ones. Idols acknowledge that it isn't the city that makes the people great, it's the other way around. And to see Danny with a diverse set of smiling people, laughing at his goofy dance moves and his enthusiastic puppy dog energy, I personally find the music video to be pretty uplifting. In trying to reclaim that sign, the band are saying that the fledgling alt-right of the time are not powerful enough to take away cultural things from the collective lexicon. You cannot take this hand symbol because it doesn't belong to you alone. It is all of ours. How successful that reclamation is up for debate, but I do appreciate the gesture. And finally, they critique the place where this hatred for immigrants comes from, where they say that the government, Tories specifically, manufacture fear in much of the same ways that was discussed on Mothers, Samaritans, and television, and they channel fear into panic, which is then manifested in pain, which leads to anger and hatred. Hard times calls for people to put all of their blame onto someone as the reason for their pain, and the government redirects that pain onto immigrants, both to protect its own power and because they're racist. Idols are saying pretty bluntly that this is propaganda, that we have more in common with the Polish butcher or the Nigerian mother of three than we actually do with billionaires, landlords, and the Tories of whom they represent. All this, they're all the same pricks of different names. One observation that I do find interesting given by the Melon Man himself is that the chorus is inspired by oi punk, which is a subgenre that was famous for not being very good when it came to race. By appropriating the sound of oi and in trying to reclaim the OK sign, they are trying to stay true to punk's revolutionary appeal and its egalitarian tendencies and roots. Never made more apparent than when Joe spells out Danny's name followed by community so fuck you. Punk as an ethos is inherently pro-immigrants' rights and pro-abolition of borders, so it's incredibly punk to stand together with them. Danny might not have been born British, but he contributes more to that culture than any Tory ever does. Joy puts forth the idea that happiness and solidarity are actually radical. Being miserable makes you complacent with contemporary politics, so miserable that you are likely to fall for conservative propaganda that you might drown in a well of apathy. In seeming reaction to leftists who fell into depression after Bernie Sanders lost the ballot in 2016, and then voted for Trump as a countercultural statement, this watch the world burn, it'll be funnier than letting the libs win type of nonsense. In the face of a politics that thrive over nihilism and apathy, idols proclaim that joy is an act of resistance. The establishment fosters from and fosters depression. Being happy and passionately fighting for what you believe in is antithetical to that ethos. The type of punk that idols practice affirms the value of love, tolerance, and being a decent person so that you can give more of yourself to other people. It challenges men to break the cycles of self-hatred and rage that often lead to abusive and destructive situations. They proclaim, if indirectly and unstuck in time, that the troglodyte is wrong because he lacks the capacity for love. Not biologically, but spiritually. That he has been incentivized to do this himself by systemic and cultural forces, and that if he is able to attain and hold onto love and empathy, he would live a more fulfilling life. I think that is such a true and powerful perspective. The first album was so angry, and fair enough. Joe was going through something truly awful. But on Joy, he dared to wish a better life for himself and his friends. He turned from a leftist heel, and he dared to heal those around him. And I genuinely think that is so beautiful. But I've had one problem with this album. It would be that there is this tension in their music. And I think that the band, they're right to, express the value of immigrants and the value of self-love in a society and hegemonic system that deflates ego for profit. But idols aren't exactly interested in facing Tories head-on in a strict ideological battle. Sure, they try to reach men in the throes of toxic masculinity, and they are trying to speak to those who think immigration is bad. But some of their rhetoric comes across as more hypocritical than sincere. The end of Never Fight a Man with a Perm is a good example of this, where the lyrical content is violent and overly masculine, but there is this quick, wiping the hands clean gesture of, "Oh, shut my mouth, let's hug it out." This comes after this expert shotgun blast of attacking modern masculinity, gym bros, yuppie cunts, sigma males, all taken to task in hilarious detail. The song's title reads as this, deeply ironic gag, this deep regret after waking up from a fistfight-induced coma. So the admission that violence doesn't solve much and that kindness is a better route, not to say that violence is always bad, by the way, punch a Nazi, pop the wheels of an oil tycoon's car, fuck him to death. But this kindness contradicts the music video, of which is gloriously, unabashedly, and wonderfully violent. And sure, Joe and Roy the Walking Thyroid or whatever, they kiss at the end, but the kiss is meant to gross you out. It's not sensual. And with the amount of violence seen in the video, it feels a bit tonally confusing for them to all have gone to heaven. It's a tricky one. I would actually say that the expectations of toxic masculinity control men as fighting game characters are controlled by a player. But are they not just preaching to the choir? Are we not just telling people what they already want to hear? This tension exists, and it does conflict a bit with their intentions. And some people read this contradiction as virtue signaling, as self-defeating and as self-glorifying, as pantomiming progress that is ultimately not useful or profound at all. According to a admittedly pretty funny popular critique, idols just sound like a band of mascots invading your school cafeteria to sing about how bullying is bad. It was this feeling that was at the core of a major backlash against the band that took place from around 2019 through 2021. It still lingers today, and like with my critique of Cave World, there exists very few retrospectives on that backlash, which is curious, because it is so fascinating. I experienced this firsthand, and I wondered why anyone would think that about a band that genuinely seems to just want the best for us. And since no one has talked about it at length on this platform, I guess, once again, it falls to me to do all of the discourse myself. Yeah, look, okay, I didn't think that many people would want to watch, a 6-hour-long video about, 2 punk bands, so you're gonna have to wait till next time until we talk about the Idols backlash through the medium of their 2020 album, Ultramono.